So I'd say one of the things I just think is an absolute and it's an outrage in our system. I really do. Is that we grade schools inadequate, including their leaders and teachers in them, and I just think that the fact that we even use that language about people and schools is an atrocity.
Welcome to Rethinking Education. Education's critical friend.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to episode 19 of the Rethinking Education Podcast. Tom Sherrington is one of those guests who probably needs no introduction, but in case his prolific output has somehow passed you by these last few years, here's a quick one. A former teacher and school leader with over 30 years' experience, more recently Tom has become a hugely popular blogger, author, and training provider. His blog, Teacherled, has had approaching 7 million hits, and his recent publications, Rosenshine's Principles in Action and the Teaching Walkthru series, co-authored with Oliver Caviglioli, are pretty much permanent fixtures at the top of the educational book charts. Here are a few excerpts from reviews that people have written about Tom's previous book, The Learning Rainforest, in which he sets out his philosophy for teaching and learning. Jeff Barton, the General Secretary of the Association for School and College Leaders, wrote, "In the time that I have known Tom Sherrington, I've learnt so much about pedagogy and classroom practice from his blogs and tweets. Now it's a real treat to have a compendium of his experience, wisdom, and insights, all rooted in such an optimistic view about why great teaching matters. This is an indispensable book for classroom practitioners at all stages of their career." Peter Hyman, the executive head teacher of School 21, wrote, "This book is a huge leap forward in transcending the sterile debates between traditionalists and progressives. Hacking through the undergrowth of academic research and passing fads, Tom takes his readers on a journey through the rainforest to the sunny uplands of classrooms in which powerful learning and rich experiences can flourish. Whether you agree with every word here is not the point. This is a book that will get you thinking, reflecting, changing the way you teach, and questioning the very essence of effective teaching." And Deborah Kidd, the guest on episode 1 of the Rethinking Education podcast, wrote, "Teachers have been thrashed by changing tides of policy and ideology for decades. They have been bamboozled and confused by consultants and theories trying to shape them into this fad and that. They are tired, and what they need is a light, a sensible, balanced, well-informed light. Tom's book is that light for many teachers, especially those in the secondary sector. It offers a way through the arguments and debates that sometimes polarize education, and in a clear, intelligent, and open way offers practical and thoughtful solutions." Much of this richness comes through in this conversation, which I think that you will really enjoy. In the first part of this conversation, you may notice that there are a few minor glitches due to faltering bandwidth. I've done my best to edit these out, but some of them are kept in, A, because you can hear what's being said, and B, because it's interesting stuff. Anyway, whenever it happens, it's a short-lived problem, so please do not adjust your set. I really enjoyed this wide-ranging and at times quite emotive conversation with Tom, in which, among other things, we discussed Rosenshine's Principles of Instruction, the importance of effective behaviour management systems, and why we need to stop grading schools. I hope you enjoy the show. Tom Sherrington, welcome to the Rethinking Education Podcast.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I've been looking forward to this for a while. Great to be on the show with you.
Yeah, it's great to. I'm looking forward to it too, and I appreciate it especially because I understand that you got up super early today to do a talk. Were you doing a talk in Thailand? Were you?
Well, it's for a organisation called Fabissia, which is a British international schools in Asia, and they have a conference. So yeah, I did a keynote for them, and then I did 2 1-hour workshops. One was on instructional coaching, and one was on Rosenshine's principles. So the whole thing was 4:30 a.m. for me was the first time. So I've been up for hours.
Wow. And it's only 10 a.m. Total respect to you there. If I was you, I'd be straight back into bed. So it seems that you might have some virtual jet lag, which might make for an interesting conversation. Let's see. So a while ago, you were on a really interesting episode of Ollie Lovell's podcast, the ERRR, as I'm sure you remember, which was about the most important thing, wasn't it? It was like, what's the most important thing about behaviour, about curriculum, about assessment, pedagogy, and so on. And I really recommend to listeners to check that out if they haven't done it already. In the Rethinking Education podcast, I like to explore different territory, as the name would suggest. First of all, I really like to get to know the person that I'm talking to. Who are you? What was your own experience of education? What key moments have shaped your thinking along the way? You know, why is it that you think what you think, and why do you do what you do? And then we get into the rethinking education part of the conversation, where we think about, you know, what do you see that's really good? What are the major challenges that we think we face currently, and how might we overcome those challenges? So we'll get into all of that. But I think I'd like to start with the fact that you have become something of a publishing phenomenon in recent years, or at least part of a publishing phenomenon. I know there's some other people involved in this. So I saw you posted something on Twitter recently, which was about how I think you shared your first ever little mini sort of post that you wrote. Was it when you were at Keggs at King Edward Grammar School? Is that right?
Yeah.
And so, and you said you'd written something like almost 1,000 blogs since then in the last sort of, is that right?
Yeah, it's just over 700.
Right.
In 9 years. That's about the scale of it. Yeah.
Right. What does that work out at in frequency? 700 in 9 years. It's almost 100 a year, isn't it? So it's like 2 a week ish.
Yeah, I mean, it varies. I mean, earlier on, I was writing a few more sort of very short ones, and more recently, it's been sort of 60, 70 a year. But yeah, it's that it's that sort of scale. It's about one a bit more than once a week, really. And
the statistics are phenomenal, aren't they? So your blog, I was looking at it earlier this morning. It's had something like 6.7 million hits. You've got like about 120,000 subscribers, which is quite a phenomenal thing. And so, you know, like, was this when you first wrote that short piece 9 years ago? There was a picture of Vic Reeves alongside it. So I don't know if that was like an in-joke or something. But like, was that the first time that you had written? Was this your first exercise in writing, or had you done anything before that?
Well, I had this idea when I was a teacher. Well, actually, when I was a head teacher at that school, where I felt like I had some things to share, having gone to a grammar school and always felt that it was a kind of alien world. And actually, I felt I had this message that there's something about the culture there which was very challenging, which I felt had been absent from the comprehensive schools I'd worked in before. And I was thinking, I know we can slag off selective education and say it's wrong and our principle, which I'd probably agree with, actually. But the truth is that the students there had this incredible experience, and I felt like there was something to share. So I tried to write that, and I sent an article to the TES, which they rejected, and they just said, just do a blog or something. And I didn't know what that meant. And then I went on a course. I didn't know. I thought, how would anyone ever read it if I just wrote a blog? But then I went on a course for Essex head teachers, where a guy called Alan November was talking, and he was a sort of American kind of ed tech guru kind of person. And he was saying that children should do blogging because they have a public audience and it helps them really focus. They have this sort of motivational aspect to it, but also it means they step up and write more fluidly and at greater length. And I thought that would be interesting for my students. So I thought, if they're going to do it, I'm going to see what's involved. So I just dabble. So I set up a WordPress thing and thought, well, I'll have a go and see what happens when you do a blog. And that's what started. The students were writing a student newspaper, and which I had to help them set up. And one of the things they did was a kind of Mickey take of me pontificating about education. And they used Vic Reeve as the kind of symbol of that, because they just thought I reminded them of him. And so they would take the Mickey very cleverly of the kind of edgy jargon that they heard me say and stuff. It was very funny. So that was one of my first blogs, was just sharing them. And I was quite proud of that, because actually at the time, this is one of the things that I did there, was I wanted to see how far you could go with student ownership of a newspaper. And I established the protocol that the student newspaper was totally uncensored and it was published without any teacher scrutiny.
Wow.
And we did it because we appointed editors, and we had this relationship where we'd say, so you're the editor, and there's this trust thing, and you print what you want, but you know there's a responsibility that carries, and so you have to own it. You have to. So we did, and that was an important part of the selection process of who was the editor, that they had to be able to carry the trust. But it meant that every time the newspaper came out, it was like, oh God, what have they said? And I loved that. It was a kind of risky kind of thing, but it was great. I thought it was really high quality as well. They had a student there. This is a bit sidetracking. One of the students wrote about sport, and he was called George Cox. That was his name. So his column was called Cox and Balls. And you just think, well, that is his name. So you think, well, he got away with that because that's actually his name. But there was all sorts of funny stuff, and it was very, very amusing. But anyway, so that was my first effort. And then Twitter was kind of also, I was thinking, well, what's Twitter and how can I use it? And I realized that one link to the other, I could share a blog on Twitter. And, that's where it all began. This session was, I was sitting next to Vic Goddard, who's the head teacher at in Passmore's, and we were sort of setting up our Twitter. He had loads of followers because he was famous. He'd been on the telly and everything. He tweeted me saying, "Oi mate, I'm your 50th follower." I was like, "Yeah, get in." I remember showing my son Vic Goddard off the telly as my 50th follower. It was great, and that's kind of where it started. And then I wrote something which actually was about marking or something. People read it. I was thinking, oh my God, people actually read this stuff. So it was really, that's how it started. And once people start reading what you write, you think, well, I'll do it again.
Right. So it seemed to take off quite quickly, because some people talk about like writing into the void for a bit at first, and they like had sort of 10 trusty followers. But it seemed to spark something quite early on.
Yeah, it did. And I remember meeting Alex Quigley at a SSAT event in 2012. We often talk about this. We sat together, and we only knew each other through Twitter. And we just sort of gravitated toward each other and said, "Hi, you're Alex, I'm your Tom." And we talked about our blogging experience, and we had about 20,000 views altogether on our blogs each, and we were sort of close. And now, I get sort of 20,000 views in a week with the volume of blogs that are on there. People are reading lots of old ones as well as new ones. But to begin with, you're sort of grateful that anyone is reading it. And that was part of it, this community feeling. So that right early on, I encountered someone like David Didow and Alex were writing John Tom Set. These are people who I know now, and we were all sort of starting to write blogs around the same time. David was obviously one of the first people, but you realize you're part of a network of people who are trying to express their ideas through blogging, and that's a big part of it, actually. That's sharing and that exchanging of ideas through writing a bit more than you might normally say on a tweet or something. And that's the big motivation for me, is that you're part of a network of people. You're not just by yourself.
Yeah. And it was an exciting time, wasn't it? There was something about that period of time, like that whole phenomenon. Now it's sort of quite normal, but like when you first ever sort of met someone off Twitter in real life, you're like, oh wow, there's something slightly surreal about it. But also it was quite interesting that like lots of those people, you mentioned David Didow, lots of the ideas that were being expressed around that time were sort of like people were changing their minds about things through this process, wasn't it? It wasn't just that people were just saying what they thought. There was like this sort of transformation that was happening partly through this network of bloggers. Is that what your experience was?
Yeah, definitely. And because you have a record of it, you can kind of tell. So when I look back at some of my old blogs, I think, gosh, I used to say that sort of thing. And I was slightly dazzled by some things which I realised I could do at kegs in the grammar school world, which I actually are just harder to do in other contexts. So even the way that I was sort of promoting ideas, I realised was not particularly helpful, even though they can exist in the world of education. They're not necessarily transferable. And so I think the way I've used to express ideas has changed and definitely made me think. And you get some comments, some kickback, and it doesn't make you think, well, when someone challenges you, you think, "God, do I really believe that?" And sometimes you think, "No, I really do," and other times it makes you think, "Well." I remember one time one of the comments which I had was from Greg Ashman, who at the time I didn't know his name because he was kind of anonymous at that point. He wrote on a blog. Well, I used to do this thing called co-construction, which for me was one of my favourite processes I've ever run in an education setting. Because I used to teach, even though I was the head, I taught RE, I taught physics, I taught maths, I taught lots of things. And I felt like the students at that school were like being given a Ferrari to drive. I thought, what can I do with these guys? Let's see what we can do. And what I found you could do is co-construct a whole course. You could start a course by saying, right, guys, what should we learn? What questions should we ask? And get them to design a sequence of learning and present lessons and do all sorts of instructional inputs. And all my students taught lessons, they did demonstrations, they organised practicals, to the point where I would make them all practice with the equipment in the prep room and order the equipment. And I'd say, well, that's your lesson. And I wouldn't prepare the lesson at all. I would literally turn up and say, so guys, okay, what are we doing today? And they would say, and they would do it. They would present slides, they'd set homework, they'd mark books. It was absolutely fantastic. These are like kids in year 9, teaching chemistry to each other. And then I got some really good GCSE results from one class who I taught in this way all the way through. And Greg just said, yeah, but that's like lucky pants. Just because you wear lucky pants on exam day doesn't mean that's the reason you did well. And he was right. I'm thinking, we just totally burst my bubble there. Now, they didn't do well because of the co-construction. They did well because they probably would have done well anyway. They did well because they were intelligent students who worked hard. And the co-construction was just a thing we did as well. It wasn't any cause and effect that I was proving.
But
that to me was a good pushback.
Yeah, well, maybe. I mean, I think there's more of a conversation to be had there, because there's also, there are other outcomes other than exam results. And so, what did they get out of the co-construction that didn't show up on the exam, but that they wouldn't have got if you'd have, gone in there with tightly planned lessons? They got to exercise ownership. They got a sense that their voice is important, that they are valued, that they can, regulate their own learning, that they can trust their own decisions. There's all kinds of other stuff that's going on in that co-construction process that's not just about the exam.
No, totally. But the problem was I'd set a trap for myself by championing their results.
Right. Okay.
So I was saying they nearly all got A stars in GCSE, the whole class. I think 2 got an A and the rest got A stars. They were amazing. And so, I sort of had foolishly tried to make a claim about that. But you're right. I mean, the other stuff was, and there were 2 particular examples. If I just talk about that briefly now, if you don't mind. One of them was Taran's plan. I still use that in some of my training whenever I get asked to talk about stretch and challenge. So Taran's plan was this amazing thing where he was one of my year 11s. And because the whole time, all the way through the course, we had mapped out that we've got to teach the syllabus. And I was always saying, where are we? I used to do that. It was like theatrically, guys, where are we? Where have we got up to so far? And they would tell me, we've covered this and we still haven't covered that. Okay, great. So what should we do next? And then there was a bit of a time I was thinking, are we going to finish the syllabus on time? So I just shared that with the class. So where are we up to? And Taran emailed me that night and he said, sir, I think I've worked it out what we could do. And he had made a spreadsheet which listed all the topics that we hadn't covered and every single lesson we had left in the year, like literally week to week. And he'd said, if we map it like this, we could probably manage it. And this boy's 15 and he's emailed me like the entire plan for the rest of the year with, he said we could do some tests here, revision here. And it was absolutely amazing. I've got this picture of it. So I show that to people like that is a boy who's 15 who feels genuine ownership of this course. He also feels he's got a relationship with me where he can say, why don't we do this? And so we just said, let's do Taran's plan. And it worked a dream. It was amazing. And the other one was a lesson where some boys this was when they were in year 10, were going to do a lesson on optics. So we're going to explain how the lenses work in the eye. And they were going to present the lesson. And I'd forgotten. that I had a meeting. So I had to say to them, I emailed them at night saying, guys, I'm not going to be there tomorrow. I've forgotten. And I've just realized it's your lesson. And they emailed me back saying, don't worry, sir, we've got it covered. And so I just emailed the cover manager and said, look, the boys think they can do it. So just put someone in there, but they'll be fine. And they did. So they taught the whole lesson without me even being there. And the cover teacher was just blown away. He just said, it was just ridiculous. They just came in, got the slides out, taught the lesson, set the work. These kids are in year 10. And it's because they felt total responsibility. It was like a genuine, legitimate role they had. And they just followed it through. It was absolutely epic. And that type of thing only happens because the trust is there, the expectations are there, and there's a sort of authenticity to it. The kids can do it if you let them. That's the thing. And this is where, in other contexts, people just say, "Oh, you couldn't do that," but you can.
And so you were saying that you could do it in this like Ferrari setting because you were with these. Was it a selective school?
Yeah, very selective.
These are very like highly able young people. Have you ever tried to work in that way in the state sector, in a non-selective setting, in like working with co-construction, for example?
Yeah, I have, and you can do it. But what you find is that you just have to manage it more. You have to scaffold it more, and you can do it where the curriculum is slightly more open. So if you have to cover the syllabus, you feel slightly less relaxed about the students presenting something if you know that it's really they're benefiting from it because they're delivering, but the children around them are finding it much harder to engage with because it's just there's a skill set that the presenters don't have when they're leading lessons. So you find that you end up stepping in a bit more and being a bit more selective in who maybe does certain things. But you can do things like at the beginning of a course, especially in Key Stage 3, where the stakes are lower and it's more flexible. You can say, here's a topic. What questions do you think we could ask about this? What should we study? What might be a good way through this process? And then get the students to design questions and things. And then you can actually say, well, look, here's the scheme of work. Guess what? A lot of your questions are on it. And you give them this feeling of being involved. And some things definitely work, like constantly getting the students to have a sense of ownership of where are we in the course? Where are we through the curriculum? But it's just the kind of input side of it you have to be a little bit more careful with, because some children, they just find it genuinely hard to stand up and genuinely teach something. It's more like they're giving a presentation, but it's not really explanatory in the same way some slightly more higher attaining students can do. So that's a slight difference. Yeah. And also in terms of the safeguarding, there are just harder things, like the idea that you trust a group of year 10s to lead a lesson without that would just be a riskier thing, and you wouldn't want to put pressure on the cover teacher. So you just feel like, I don't think I can do that here because it's just not fair on those people.
Yeah, I can see what you mean, and I mean we maybe get into this later. I don't know, but I see what you mentioned earlier about how you're not persuaded particularly that selective education is a good thing, or that, at least that you had reservations about it, and I think that probably most people share those. I certainly do. But there is something about, I can see what you're saying, because I have worked in, not as a teacher, but as a consultant in many private schools, and, some of them very affluent independent schools. And they're amazing places. They really are, like, phenomenal. And if it was possible for, in some utopian world, for every local school to be like, Habs or whatever, you would want that for your kid, wouldn't you? And I've heard it argued that, that to level the playing field, to get rid of private schools, like Labour were arguing in the last election, and to just sort of level the playing field would in some sense be an act of vandalism, because you'd be taking something that is really extraordinary, unfair and unequal though it is, and you'd be sort of just making everything more of a sort of homogenous middle zone.
Yeah, I feel like, it is a challenge. You have to, there are two things. There's sort of in the long run, or in the ideal world, do you think we should have people opting out of the state sector or having selective education? No. So, but how do we deal with what we've got now? Do you close schools that are already highly functioning and sort of meshed into their community in a certain way? And again, I'd say no. So what you have to do is plan a reform process which is legitimate. And there are changes you can make, like opening selective schools to have less of, to be less selective, and having a. And I think there are changes that you could make and move towards that. But essentially, the debate to have is: do we think in the state sector you should have essentially specialist schools for high attaining students, given all the benefits, all the stuff that people try to claim in the grammar school sector around social justice and stuff. I think, having worked in that sector, are just totally unjustifiable. And similarly in the independent sector, it always frustrates me that people want their cake and eat it. They don't like the idea that they're not sort of doing the social justice bit, having decided to work in a selective environment or an independent environment. And I just think, well, you just have. And it is, I'm sorry, you can't have it both ways. In the comprehensive state sector is much more demanding in many, many ways. And you have to be comfortable with the choice that you make. And ultimately, when I was working in a grammar school, I wasn't. I felt increasingly, every time I met all my comprehensive school colleagues, that I couldn't justify my own school's existence. And that was something which eventually made me quite keen to leave, to find a comprehensive school I could work in, which, as we'll maybe talk about later, didn't work out so well. But there are some things about those schools which are amazing. And you think, well, why can't we have this elsewhere? It's an interesting conversation. Some of the traditions are amazing. I still remember assemblies, wearing my gown, looking like a character from Hogwarts, and all the children singing Jerusalem, 1,000 students singing Jerusalem at the top of their voices with real gusto and passion. It's amazing. And you think, wow, look at this. And some of the vertical modelling I saw at that school was exceptional. So right from year 7, the students see the sixth formers in their presence on the stage, talking, giving out notices. You've got year 13 saying, the Philosophy Society is meeting at lunchtime, make sure you're there. They're the ones organising the house music and the house drama, and they're debating. And you've got 11-year-olds mixing with 18-year-olds. It's an amazing kind of journey to go on and to see all that working. So you're constantly thinking, how can we put that into a more mixed setting? And there are some challenges. So I think we can learn from selective schools, because what they do is, in some cases, just unbelievable. But I still don't think you can justify the social selection and the privilege within the state sector. I just think it is a complicated dilemma.
Yeah, thank you. So let's go back to the publishing thing. So as far as I can tell, the first book that you published was called Teach Now: The Joy of Teaching Science. Is that correct? Is that the first one that you wrote?
Yeah, that's the first one I wrote. That was part of a series that Jeff Barton was putting together, and he asked me to do the science one, and there was a history one and an English one and a maths one and so on.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I've not read that book, but I was just wondering about the. So it seems to me that there are essentially two types of teachers, in that there are teachers who are really into their subject, especially at secondary, teachers who are really into their subject and they're really passionate about developing the next generation of scientists or historians or whatever it might be, and there are other people who are really interested in helping kids develop more widely, that whole developing the whole child, as it's sometimes referred to, and that's something that I certainly found. I was a science teacher like yourself, and I used to find that it was quite frustrating sometimes that when I was restricted to talking to kids about science, there were some kids that I just couldn't begin to get interested in a conversation about nuclear power stations or electromagnets or the periodic table or whatever it was. Some of them would just look at me, that sort of 1,000-yard dead-eyed stare you get sometimes. Some kids just what are you even on about? You irrelevant man, just go away sort of thing. They don't say it, but you can just see it in their eyes. They're you just can't connect with them. And I found that when I started teaching PSHE with those same kids, they would come alive in conversations about other things. And it might be, just a reflection on my own limitations as a science teacher. But I wonder if you recognise that, and do you think that you sort of fall primarily into like really, really into like the joy of teaching science? And I know that you are really into teaching science, or do you recognise this other sort of broader view of teaching, as a process of human development rather than sort of developing subject knowledge?
Well, that's a good question. I for me, it's hard to separate them. I definitely find the subject side of it really fantastic, and for me, I feel like the relationship side of it comes through that. You're always teaching students something, and of course, there is an aspect of just being around young people that and enjoying the relationship building aspect of it generally. And I've always enjoyed things like residentials and field trips where you get to talk to children in a slightly different setting. But I don't think I'd have sustained a career in teaching if it wasn't for that. When I'm in the classroom with students and I'm getting to explore some aspect of physics or maths, that would be the most important thing. So yeah, I think they go together, don't they? But I definitely think that a lot of really good teacher-student relationships are forged through the enthusiasm about the learning. Definitely for me. I mean, I used to be sort of like a magnet for kind of geeky science students coming up to me after lessons and saying, "Oh, sir, have you seen this? And sir, have you seen that?" And I used to love that. And they used to as well. Like this boy used to talk to me all about Kevlar and different bulletproof vests and, "Sir, have you seen this? It's really cool. Have you heard that they've developed this new material that does that?" And you think, that kid needs me there to talk to about his geekery, and I was happy to provide that.
Yeah. That was one of my favourite things about, you get those kids, they've like torn out some little newspaper article about space that they read at the weekend. They're like, "Oh, look at this. They've discovered a new galaxy or something." It is amazing when that happens. And I wonder, just reflecting on my own past, because did you do a degree in physics?
Yeah, so I did pure physics.
Yeah, so you were like really into science. I think that like I had some sort of bad careers advice at some point when I was a kid. I chose sciences because my brother, who was older than me, had nailed it and had like got straight A's, and he'd done sciences and he went on and became a doctor. And I ridiculously chose to do science because he had done them and he made it look easy. And it would have taken like a 10-second conversation for somebody to say, "Oh, right, are you good at science?" And I'd be like, "No, not really. Are you interested in it? Not really. Well, maybe they're not the subjects for you." And so I ended up sort of doing science, doing all the sciences at GCSE, 3 science A-levels, did hopelessly badly in them, scraped into a science degree at uni, quickly transitioned out of it later on. So maybe it was just, maybe I just wasn't really into science that much from the outset. Maybe I wasn't that well suited to teaching science for that reason.
Well, maybe, but I found, I used to love physics at school, and I did it for A-level, and I suppose, I felt I was reasonably good at it, but then, never had any other degree in mind. Pure physics, that was always what I was going to do, and I just loved it. I loved measuring things and the whole thing. I loved the two ends of it, sort of particle physics and learning about leptons and stuff, and also the cosmology. So the big and the small, and fascinating stuff for me. And so for me that was straightforward. And then my first job was in a sixth form college because I felt like I had a taste of that on my teaching practice, so that I felt like I was in my element there. For 3 years, I just taught A-level physics and maths, and I really felt like that was a good thing for me to develop the skills of being a teacher and getting to work with slightly older students and not having to worry so much about behaviour management, which sort of was something I discovered later. But you mentioned the book, The Joy of Teaching Science. I did feel slightly, because when I wrote that, I was a head teacher, and it was a bit, I thought, should I really be writing this book? I'm not really a full-on science teacher anymore. And I wrote a book about the things I felt were quite foundational, sort of traditional experiments and things like that. And one of the reviews on Amazon, it's hilarious. It's probably one of the worst reviews any book has ever had. It literally says, "Fear for your children." That's the headline, "Fear for your children." 1 star. And it's basically somebody saying, this is the kiss of death to your kids' enjoy of science, because they just hated the fact that I was saying do these sort of tried and tested practicals. And I think that's odd. It's like the luxury of someone who is an expert in Shakespeare and then decides that it's a bit old hat and wants to teach something else. Children have an entitlement to do basic foundational things that are traditional, because that's where what the subject is built on. And the fact that we could do more modern things or more contemporary things as well, that's true. But I do think there are some foundational experiments which I think are really, really important for teachers, certainly, to know how to do them. So anyway, this guy hated it.
Fascinating. And there's a microcosm of the education debate in a nutshell, isn't it? Somebody writes a book called The Joy of Teaching Science, and so the review is Fear for Your Children.
Yeah.
There it is. Okay, so then later on came the Learning Rainforest, and I know that this is a metaphor that you have, you wrote about it for a long time in your blog, and it was interesting. I'd be interested to hear about your use of that metaphor and what the key idea is in that book. And just to introduce it, I just share a little bit from Martin Robinson wrote the foreword, which is really interesting. He says, "It is environment that leads Sherrington into his chosen metaphor, the learning rainforest, and one is struck by the organic vision this conjures up. His ideal school seems far away from the exam factory of common conception. Is the Rainforest School a place in which children roam free to explore? Are you about to read a book full of 60s hippie idealism in which anarchy and chaos are just one step away? Fortunately not." So what is the idea of the learning rainforest, and why is it that you're so struck by this as a metaphor for your vision of what schools and what education should be?
I think it came out of a reflection that when I was at Keggs and also previously and various schools, but I was sort of starting to write about teaching, and I'd done a couple of sessions.
A couple of what sessions? Sorry.
So training sessions, sort of
right.
Delivering CPD, and I felt like I was trying to persuade teachers that when we were sharing ideas, we weren't mandating specific responses, because that was people's experience, that when we're being told stuff, we're being told what to do. And I was saying, no, I'm not telling you what to do. I'm sharing ideas that you can then use. So I wanted to convey this idea that it's not a plantation. We're not here sort of mandating stuff. And so I thought, well, what's the opposite of a plantation? It's rainforest. So I use this metaphor of plantation thinking and rainforest thinking. So plantation thinking meaning when someone has a good idea, then everyone has to do it because it must be good. Therefore, it must be good for everybody. And I thought, no, because Keggs, for example, there were some of the most maverick, eccentric, off-message teachers you've ever found, and they were all really good. So you realise that even if you wanted to tell them what to do, they wouldn't do it. So but they were excellent in their own way. So rainforest thinking is encouraging excellence to take form, but not mandating what that form should be. And I felt that was a really useful metaphor then for the students. You can find children can do amazing things that you didn't realize they could do because you set up the conditions where that's possible. So you motivate them, you challenge them, you make sure they know a lot, but then you say, right, what can you do with it? And they kind of surprise and delight you, like when you walk through a rainforest. So I found that the rainforest metaphor really captured this spirit of teaching where trees don't grow by magic. There's a logic, there's a science, there's a kind of a procedure that's followed, but the outcomes can be diverse. So I just think there's a lot in that metaphor which rings true for me. There's this structural aspect, there's a logical aspect, you can explain why things happen, but the form it takes can be much more different and varied than people sometimes allow.
Yeah, okay, I see. And so it's sort of about diversity, isn't it? And that's the thing about the rainforest. It's not a plantation. Things are different, and yet it sort of works as like a harmonious whole as well. There's something about diversity that is simultaneously, it's like the ecosystem idea. And this is something that I think about a lot as well about like the way in which I think that, like, I was talking to somebody the other day and they said, like, what's the one thing, if you could change one thing, like what would it be? And it really made me sort of pause for a minute. And I think that it would just be about like loosening the screws a little bit or a lot, and celebrating and recognizing the diversity of experience, the diversity of interests. Because, you know, we know one thing about child development is that they're not all the same, you know, and that they develop at different rates. And lots of what we do is because it's efficient, and because it's efficient to process kids in age-based batches, for example. It's efficient to have them in classrooms and sitting in rows. It's efficient to teach in certain ways within the constraints of that system. And it's efficient to have them all sit the same exams in the same sort of month when they're, you know, age 15 or 16. But just because it's efficient doesn't mean that it's, you know, that it's in those young people's best interests. And I think that it's something that I'd really like to see more of, like just to have to somehow think of a way that we can increase the flexibility and to be responsive to the needs and interests of young people. You know, while bearing in mind that this still needs to be scalable, because, you know, the fact is that there's like loads of kids, right? And there's many more of them than there are teachers. And so we need to think of this in a way that isn't going to lead to that kind of chaos that Martin was alluding to in that foreword.
Yeah, I mean, I think these are some of the challenges that you wrestle with. And sometimes people teach as if they're running a tutorial for 4 people with a kind of audience of 26. And that doesn't work, because they engage with the 4 in a way which they would if no one else was in the room. And that's a nice small group teaching situation. And you've got 26 kids who aren't practicing, who aren't thinking, who aren't engaging, sort of being dragged along. And they don't learn as much. So that you have to sort of, some instructional methods that I promote are literally based on the fact that you do have a class of 20, of 30, and you do need to make them all think, and you do need to all give them airtime. And it's not the same as if you were in a small group environment where you could be a bit more kind of loose about those things and a bit more organic. And so I do think those constraints are real. So we have to recognize that. So are we talking about an ideal world, or like the fundamentals of a learning process? Or are we talking about the realities of teaching in a social group which is bigger than you might ideally have? And of course, there's a whole group size aspect. That's just one where we have to be a very much smaller group than a class of 30 for that change to be real. Even when you're up to 10, you know, involving 10 children in a really meaningful discussion is a lot harder than 3 or 4. So beyond a very small group, I think you get into instructional teaching methods where you need to be much more deliberate about all of that. And I really think that's true. But then, you know, there are other things, like in terms of the outcomes. One of the things I feel like we mandate too much, one of my favorite techniques to use as a teacher is open response tasks as part of the flow of a lesson. Because I feel like if the children never get the chance to make choices, even bad choices, they don't learn about that dynamic. And so you need to say, okay, so what would you do now? How would you express this? And some of the best work I've ever seen from students has been where they were not told what to do. They were allowed to decide, and they made wonderful things, or just had this idea and went with it. And because it was so sort of niche, you would never have mandated that for everybody. But because they did it in their own way, it was actually quite special. And you do need to have those things. So it's about knitting those things together. You knit together those sort of moments into a more structured sort of system, so that you get the kind of best of both without it all being about all one or all the other, which is where the Learning Rainforest leads into this mode A, mode B characteristic, which I invented to. I just made it. I kind of wasn't sure whether to call it part 1 or part 2, but I was thinking, no, mode A, mode B, that works. And I found a lot of teachers have told me that they really like that, because it helps them separate 2 types of teaching, but also combine them.
Yeah. So can you? I was about to ask you about that. So can you break this down? What is mode A teaching and mode B teaching?
Well, so mode A teaching is instructional teaching. So it's, if I'm a science teacher, I need to explain to you how, refraction works or something. I'm going to show you, I'm going to give you some examples, I'm going to do a demonstration, I'm going to ask you some questions, but I'm going to guide the learning. So it's instructional teaching. If I'm a maths teacher, I know that a lot, especially if you're new to it. And so instructional teaching is mode A. Explain, model, get the students to practice what you've shown them, give them some feedback, scaffolding and so on. Whereas mode B teaching is things like the co-construction, where the students are preparing a presentation, or you say, respond any way you like, or go and make something which represents this, or an open-ended investigation, or where you're not in instructional mode. And it's got all sorts of aspects to it. Collaborative learning, where the goal is explicitly, the collaborative aspect is an actual learning goal itself, not just the knowledge aspect of it, all kinds of things. So that's what it means.
Yeah, okay. So mode A teaching is instructional teaching, and that's like explaining, modelling, probing for understanding, things like think, pair, share, feedback, that traditional teaching, essentially, traditional sort of standard, pedagogy. And then mode B stuff, the examples that you give in the book are things like, hands-on teaching, throwing them in at the deep end, doing project-based learning, doing creative projects, class forums, and so on. And in the so as you know, I sort of touched upon this idea in the book that I wrote recently with Kate McAllister, Fear is the Mind Killer, which was about learning to learn and self-regulated learning. And essentially, I don't know if this adheres with your vision, but essentially I see mode A as being, traditional teaching of subject knowledge, and mode B teaching is the sort of the learning to learn stuff. Essentially, it's about that stuff that we were talking about earlier, the sort of the developing the whole child thing, and you were saying that the two are intertwined, and of course they can be. And in the book, you sort of you suggest like an 80-20 ratio of like mode A to mode B, although you recognize that that's just a number that you come up with, and that people might argue about that, and it might look different in different contexts. Can you explain a bit about how you see that ratio working?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very loose idea. It's me reflecting on what I think I would typically do. So it's not even a recommendation. It's just saying I personally feel that most of my time is instructional, because that's what I need to do. And then I about 20% of the time, so one lesson in 5 or whatever, roughly, or whatever it is. It's not literally like that, but you're saying like, over to you, you go and do things. And it's interesting because for me, I mean, it's good to try and make these connections, but I would say you're learning to learn when you're doing instructional teaching, because when you're sort of, for example, doing retrieval practice, in an instructional setting, you're learning to learn then about how do I know what I know, how do I practice stuff, how do I learn from a modeling procedure while I'm being shown something, how do I absorb that information and then learn to do something. That's learning to learn. So I don't see it in that same way. And also when you're doing, say, a project, which is something you've designed, there's a meta aspect to it. How do I do a project? But it's about something. It's actually a subject-based thing, and you're actually learning the curriculum that is that subject. So I don't separate them in that way. It's more the mode of learning, and it's more to do with being sort of perhaps teacher-led rather than student-led is perhaps more like it. And things like so the way I see it is to make choices which are creative. Yes. So how? Well, by giving them a structure where they can make a really good, sound choice about how to express an idea, how to pull information together from different sources and present it. That helps them synthesize that into a coherent schema, and they have to then communicate that. So they're developing that skill. So I think all those things like oracy and communicating have to have an authenticity. They have to be for a reason. And if you weave them into a curriculum structure like a project where they have to present their findings, it's got depth to it. So it absolutely isn't anything to do with not having a strong subject or curriculum home. It really is strongly subject-led. It's just the students are making the choices. And some of those ideas on there, like deep end, it's when you conspicuously don't instruct them, where you sort of hold back and say, right, I want you to work this out for yourselves, and I want you to see what you do when you really need to draw on your resources. And I've seen some amazing lessons at Kegs where it was just incredibly demanding. The teachers were saying, I'm not going to help you about this. I want you to really sweat it out. But the students knew that was what it was supposed to feel like. They didn't panic because they were told it was going to be hard. And so they were learning what it feels like to struggle and to cope with that. But it was about some maths problems, or it was about wrestling with some really complicated maps in geology or geography and having to link them all together. And the teacher was saying, I'm not going to help you. It was great. I loved it. But then, of course, they could do that because they'd already been taught enough knowledge to sort of use it, and then it would come in. So that, to me, is how it works. It's more about the teacher taking more of a back seat in mode B, but still strongly guiding it and weaving it into the whole.
Yeah, I see. And thank you for that. I absolutely take your point. I think that teacher-led versus student-led is a better way of thinking about it, rather than, distinguishing between knowledge and learning to learn, because of course the two are intertwined. There is something that's like, so I've thought about this a lot, and since we're on the topic of learning to learn, let's just touch on this briefly. Since learning to learn became the language of learning to learn sort of really started to take root in around the 70s, when metacognition first sort of entered the lexicon, people were talking about whether, like, can you teach this stuff discreetly? Can you help young people to become more self-regulated, independent, resilient, whatever words it is that you want to use, describe them to be, effective, proactive, on the front foot learners, or should this be infused throughout the curriculum? And it seems like the version that you're describing is an infusion model, where like these practices of, like you say, oracy and debating and project-based learning and student-led stuff is happening within subject classrooms. And most people seem to agree that is the way to do it. But from my experience and from the research that I've seen done, there was a really interesting study that was done where lots of teachers were interviewed about their understanding of learning to learn. And there's like a narrow conception and a broad conception of it. And I think that a narrow conception of it is things like, you were talking about retrieval practice and how memories work, and mnemonic memory strategies and study skills and revision techniques and exam techniques and stuff like that. And then there's this broader conception of learning to learn, which is about like essentially it's that sense of becoming. It's like about self-actualization. So it's about helping the young person to grow into themselves, to be able to become more confident, and for that confidence to grow and to spill out into other areas and so on. And that's a broader agenda, and it's something that you can do through, for example, projects where they get to choose the topic. So although we would have subjects, there would be when we did projects in learning to learn lessons, there weren't projects about nothing. There would be projects about about something, but they were able to exercise choice about what that topic was. And they were therefore able to follow their own interests, and they were able to sort of to grow in that way. And what I've found is that the 80-20, this idea of an infusion model, it's like it's the ideal version in theory, but in practice it doesn't work, because most teachers in this study, where they interviewed lots of teachers about their understanding of learning to learn, most teachers have got a narrow conception of learning to learn, that they think that it's about this sort of this agenda, which is about passing tests essentially, or improving memory, and it's not addressing this broader agenda, which I think that there you could argue that there's a space for. And even where teachers did find that where teachers did have that broad conception of learning to learn as a process of like human development, of becoming more fully yourself, they couldn't find time to do that stuff within the context of subject learning. And that was certainly my experience as a science teacher. Like, there's so much stuff to cover that it just ends up that it becomes all mode A, and like the mode B stuff just sort of gets squeezed out.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's funny because I started talking about like in retrieval practice as just part of it, but of course there's a much broader scope to that. And so when I'm talking about my students having done co-construction or open-ended projects or a class forum, all the things I put in my Mode B section in the Learning Rainforest are things that I've done myself. And so for me, that is what I'm saying. So it's not that you squeeze it out, because you're saying, I don't want them to just learn this through instructional teaching, because I think there is more to it. So that's why it's there. But I still feel like it's located in a curriculum. And for me, when I've spoken to teachers, even though there are some potentially transferable aspects from that self-esteem building and some sort of basic sort of planning skills and learning how to organize time and self-regulation that transfer, you do it through the curriculum. And of course, like you say, you have some choices. So you might say, why don't we carve out some time from a curriculum and get students to do any project they like? And that's okay. But then there are some deficits in terms of teacher knowledge. So, for example, when I've got students doing co-construction, that wouldn't work if they were just sort of teaching their friends stuff that they wanted to teach. There's a rigor there that I'm saying, no, I want you to explain how the ticker tape timer works, which is a solid bit of curriculum knowledge, and I can tell you've done it well. And there's a huge amount of to stand up and explain to your class how that works is a very deep process to go through and deliver well, which the students I used to teach did do well. But it's the vehicle for the skills of the oracy and the confidence is a curriculum thing which has got depth. So for me, like you said, there is always a project about something, but if that something is connected to the instructional teaching as part of a whole, it's going to be more likely that the students will do it well, I think. And even some of the things that you've described in your project, where you were sort of talking about the genericism of the learning to learn, I actually felt that when you described it to me, it felt like just a curriculum, like some writing skills, that's curriculum. And even when the students have made a choice, they've made a choice of a curriculum area, which still has a knowledge content. And that is knowledge that they are using in order to then develop their other skills. So there's always content, there's always substance.
Yeah.
And so I feel like it's almost like a different way of just deciding what that content is, rather than saying, is there content? Because of course there is. And so that's curriculum and it's knowledge.
Yeah, absolutely. And we called it the learning skills curriculum, recognizing that there is absolutely knowledge in it. And I had a really interesting conversation. Again, this was on Ollie Lovell's podcast, where we're talking about, like, there are, you need to be, like, we're talking in Learning to Learn about developing a skilled learners. They're skilled in using the internet, they're skilled at organizing their time and resources and so on. And then underneath those sort of learning skills or habits is knowledge. There's knowledge about how to use the internet, and there's knowledge about how to organize a good discussion, and then beneath that the skills again. And it's like this sort of interesting regress. And fundamentally, there's an emotional aspect to this, and this again is something that I think is sometimes missing from the discussion about this, that we talk about learning to learn and metacognition as though they're synonymous. I know that the EEF it says on their website, metacognition, also known as learning to learn. And in my view, that's only one small part of it. There's metacognition, absolutely, but there's also, cognition, but there's also behaviors. And underneath all of that stuff, there's fundamentally like an emotional response to learning, to being at school in general, to particular subjects, to particular teachers. And you sort of need to engage all levels of this. It's like it's a complex problem that requires a solution that reflects that complexity.
That's why I think,
anyway, I don't want to
that's why I feel like you need to stud the kind of the curriculum that you've planned. Like even if you're very sort of strongly teacher led and you've got this anxiety about curriculum coverage, and you feel that in your experience you need to be leading it and instructional teaching is key, I still feel like, I get all of that, but then stand back from it and say, so what are you saying that in the whole time you're teaching that class, or imagine you taught them from year 7 to year 11, say in a secondary, are they never going to do a project? And the people will say, well, no, I don't mean never. So you say, okay, so when then? When will it happen then? When are they going to get that chance to make a choice or express themselves or have an opinion or select some aspect of the learning or feel some ownership of it beyond being just guided through by you? It has to happen at some point. When you get them to sort of maybe produce something which they then can share with the class, which is showing their personal interest in the subject. Are you never going to do that? No, I'm not saying never. Okay, so when then? And you have to start saying, well, if these things have to be planned, they don't just happen because you like them, but you've got to plan them. You've got to start saying, well, let me create a... So then people say, but they're not very good at them. So you say, okay, but how do you get good at anything? You get good at something by doing it more than once. So if we want students to be good at doing presentations so they're valid, they have to do more than one. You have to say, do we value that children coming in and talking in a prepared way about their knowledge, or even in a structured but spontaneous way? Yes. Okay, so the first time they do it, they might not be very effective. So we have to then build their capacity so it becomes more and more productive, so that when they're older, it's really fruitful and rich. And so you have to sort of, these mode B things, to me, it's so important that they're wedded in. They're not stuck on the side, and they are seen as absolutely essential. And that hopefully that's the message I'm trying to get across.
Yeah, I can see that, and I can absolutely value, that. It seems to me that the Learning Forest is a pretty good attempt at, in a number of previous conversations that I've had on this podcast, we've talked about the need for a sort of a Hegelian, if it's not too putting it into grand terms, a Hegelian synthesis of these like different teaching approaches, essentially, that are sometimes very simplistically categorized as like trad and prog. And that actually we can work towards some sort of an integrated vision of how these things can combine together. And it seems like that's what you were trying to do with that book. And I think that you achieved some notable success with it. And I don't want to dwell too long on this learning to learn piece. Okay. But as we're here, I just want to there's just one more point I think that is interesting to explore, which is that like the whole idea of self-regulation, it seems like you're not persuaded in the idea that we should have like separate lessons. You were saying that it should happen within the context of subject lessons, but it seems to me that there's like a fundamental incompatibility in trying to help young people to become self-regulated learners in what's essentially an externally regulated environment, because it's regulated, the what it is that they can learn is regulated by the teacher or by the curriculum. And it seems to me, and on the flip side, you were talking about developing oracy skills, for example. That's like, not all teachers are equally comfortable with that. They're not confident in, for example, even in their own oracy skills. And so when you're talking about developing debating, for example, like that's quite a specific skill set that the majority of teachers don't have, and a knowledge base that the majority of teachers don't have. And I think that if we farm out, if we sort of outsource aspects of that mode B stuff to a learning to learn team who really are into all of that stuff and they really do get it, then you can make it much more efficient when, than having it taught sort of badly or to different standards by, different subject teachers all across the piece.
Yeah, I can see that argument. My experience has been, though, that there are lots of opportunities to use authentic, what I call authentic sort of embedded things. So, in previous school, we did a map of oracy opportunities across the school from year 7 to year 13. And before we kind of said everyone needs to do X, we said, well, what's already happening? And you worked out that, in history, they did have debates and they wanted to do debates, and all the teachers were working on doing debating in history. And then in RE, they had another type of oracy, which was going on there. In maths, they were doing quite a lot of stand up and explain the question type oracy. And so there were numerous, and in drama, they have this type of, in art, they stand by their work and explain their thought process. So there are lots of different forms of organic, authentic opportunities for speaking in different formats already. And so we're just saying, so what we need to do is make sure that that's an experience which is universal, which is done well, and that across the piece they get that. In terms of something like an open-ended project, so I agree. I think there are things like, maybe this will come to this at some point, but I'm a big supporter of the notion of having a baccalaureate style qualification that we work towards in schools and colleges. And part of that I would always recommend would be a personal project. And I've worked with schools where they do that at Key Stage 3. They do it definitely in the sixth form with the EPQ. And I've known primary schools where the children all do a personal project. And that's where they do develop this sort of self-regulation about producing something personal. And I've always found those things to be incredibly valuable. when I was the head at Kegs, we used to do like a competition for, which had a prize to sort of motivate people, and which was to do. There were a range of projects that you could produce, like an art project, a science report, an essay. And honestly, it was some of the most incredible stuff I've ever seen students do in a school. This boy produced this anthology of his poems. Some students designed this remote control bomb disposal unit. And it was like, honestly, I just think, so, but those opportunities were part of the school fabric. So yeah, I agree. I think students do need opportunities for that kind of openness. I do agree with that. So where does that happen? Who delivers that? Does it have to be a separate kind of structural part of the curriculum? I don't know. I just think there are pros and cons to that. It depends on the curriculum constraints. And sometimes I think this rainforest thing applies. If you've got multiple organic opportunities for students to have that opportunity, sometimes that's better than trying to mandate that everyone gets it in this structure, which has still got constraints. It's still got time constraints.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Let's pause that for now. We'll definitely pick some aspects of that conversation up later. So let's go back to the publishing. So after the rainforest came Rosenshine.
Yeah.
It seems, and that's when things seem to ramp up by an order of magnitude. Can you explain firstly how this book came about and your journey and your experience of this, what became this like incredible phenomenon, really?
Yeah. So what happened with Rosenshine's Principles in Action was that I started being a consultant and doing training. Well, more and more I think of myself more as a sort of training provider than a consultant, because that's a lot of what I do. So I'd be doing training days, and people would ask me, what's a good place to go to get a sense of what, the sort of evidence-informed teaching might be, as people call it, using cognitive science. And when I came across Rosenshine's Principles, which was via Twitter and via Oliver Caviglioli's blue diagram, his wall chart thing, I thought, wow, this is great. I read it. I thought, that's such a great sort of condensation of some really core principles about effective instructional teaching. So I was saying, I did a couple of research ed presentations, and one of them was actually the first time I went to America to do research ed at US, which is very, very exciting to be able to go there. And I met Dylan William there and stuff, which was really the first time I've met him. But at that session, I did a presentation, Rosenshine's Principles, just to sort of share my thoughts about that paper with people. And this guy came up to me afterwards, who was a publisher, and he said, that would be interesting. In the US, we don't really have this kind of culture of research ed. We don't have teachers reading research papers. But there is this sort of thing called like an explainer. That's what he called it. Teachers will read sort of short pamphlets, and that there's a kind of format. So he says, do you think you could write your talk up in about 8,000 words, which you could make into a short pamphlet? So that's what he said. And so I thought, yeah. So I wrote it, but it was actually 12,000 words. It's still really short for a book. And then John Catt said, well, if you're going to publish that in America, why don't we publish it in the UK? And I said, yeah, okay. And I expected it to be like, and there's nothing. I mean, it took me about 3 days to write it. and I just was putting all the examples I'd put into my talk into the book. And then because the paper itself is free to publish, that's the copyright on it. We just said, well, let's put it in the back so people can have access to the paper. But as soon as it was published in England, it just went absolutely berserk. We just couldn't believe it. At one point, I think it got to something like number 17 of all books in the Amazon charts. On the first weekend it came out, I was looking at it going, what? That's just insane. And I was thinking, oh my God, but it's so short. People are going to hate it, because I was thinking, I was embarrassed. I was thinking, if I knew this many people would read it, I'd have written a different.
Tried harder.
I would have. I was thinking, so I sort of was opening the book going, God, what did I actually say? People are actually reading this. Oh my God, I hope it's only good. And that's really what it was like. It was a total fluke. But then people say, no, we love it because it's short. We've bought one for every teacher. They've got one in their pigeonhole. And that was the thing. It was the thing of, I want to give everyone something. So they've all read it. And weirdly, even though the PDF of Rosenshine's principles is free, no one wants to get a sort of grubby printout on some A4 in their digital. But they quite like having a nice little neat red book. And it's just totally taken off. I mean, it's sold something like, I don't know, 90,000 copies or something so far. It's just absolutely insane.
It's incredible. And so what is it that you think, apart from it being short, what is it about this that you think has really resonated with people so much?
I think it's the familiarity with their practice. It's the connection between something I already do, but with an example of maybe something I could do differently to make it slightly better. So it's things like checking for understanding, that question, what have you understood? Or some of the examples I've given in it about, what it means to do modelling and scaffolding. Or that's what people tell me. It's the examples. That's the feedback I have all the time. It's made sense to them. It's not generic. It's not a generic discussion about a research concept. It's a series of examples based in the curriculum, so that, and nearly every subject is mentioned at some point. So, and it's examples of scripted questions and stuff like that. So that's the feedback I get. It's the fact that that it's got examples, so that the ideas are not generic, that makes people feel it's useful. So yeah, that's the reason. And also then it's a kind of, because there's subject examples of a few subjects are mentioned, it makes a whole group of teachers feel they've got something in common. They can all talk about modelling and scaffolding, or guided practice and independent practice. But of course, Rosenshine himself wrote these things down. So I feel like it's just a weird sort of bridge between a body of work which even itself was, just a loose gathering of some ideas that he'd gathered, and just communicating it through the language of kind of modern schooling that people recognise. So they think, okay, I can relate to what I'm saying more than they could even reading the Rosenshine Principles paper. Mm. Even though I always telling people to read it. I mean, in some of my sessions, we open the book or the pamphlet and say, look, this is what he says. This, and I read it out to them. Because even though people have been given the book, it doesn't mean they've all read it. And I do feel like teachers need to be given a lot of space and time to engage with things, even when they've been given something in their hand.
Yeah. And so this was just after. So did you ever have any contact with Rosenshine? Because he died, didn't he, in 2017? I've just looked it up.
Yeah, he died before. So he'd already died even before I'd even heard of him. So.
Oh right, okay.
Yeah, so no,
he's having this posthumous flourish of fame.
Yeah. I mean, he'd already died, and so that wasn't really an option.
Right, amazing. And so that has led to this series of inaction books. So there's been the cognitive load theory in action that our friend Ollie wrote, and generative learning, and others. I'm assuming there are others in the pipeline.
Yeah, there's one on. So the next one's coming up. There's the Marge by Arthur Shimomura. So Nimish Ladd is writing that, and that's nearly finished. And Art Shimomura died last term. Actually, he died in October. But he had been discussing this with Nimish, and Kate Jones is writing one based on Dylan Williams and Siobhan Leahy's 5 Principles of Formative Assessment. And again, that book is currently in Dylan's hands. So Kate's finished writing it, and he's kind of commenting, and he's been very involved. And then we've got Sonia Thompson, who's a head teacher at St Matthew's in Birmingham. She's written a book with some of her colleagues on Ron Berger's An Ethic of Excellence. And Ron Berger, again, has been involved and is writing a foreword and stuff. So it's really good that when the people have been involved, that they've been close to it. So those are the next ones coming up.
Yeah.
And then we've got so there's a couple more beyond that, but those are the next 3.
Right. Fantastic. And the basic idea is that there's usually a publication at the heart of it, and it's like either a paper or a book that you're sort of simplifying or just illuminating and making, bringing to life with practical examples. Is that's the basic idea of the series?
Yeah,
isn't it?
It's the basic idea that you take a paper and then say, what does it look like in practice? And yeah, I think Ollie Lovell's book is particularly helpful because so many people have heard about cognitive load theory, but it's actually quite hard to get hold of a thin book. I mean, the John Sweller book is cost a fortune, and it's not easily accessible. And he's done a really good job of that. And the Fiorella and Mayer Generative Learning by Mark and Zoe Enser also really good. And John Thompson and his colleagues wrote this really interesting book based on the Collins paper, Cognitive Apprenticeship, and that's really interesting. But it's like that's much more of a collaborative. There's like 23 different short chapters. Each one of them is a teacher saying, "This is how cognitive apprenticeship happens in my subject." But all three of them so far have been really, really good, really interesting.
Yeah, I agree. And so lastly, the walkthroughs, which is the latest, also a hit. I'm often seeing screen grabs of like the top end of the Amazon chart. This is the education chart, but it's often like walkthroughs 1 is like number 1, walkthroughs 2 is number 2. Cognitive load theory is number 3. It's like it's dominating the top of the charts almost permanently.
Yeah, I mean, walkthroughs has been an absolute joy. I've still pinched myself that I'm able to be doing this because, if Oliver Caviglioli, Oliver had the idea for the book and approached me about writing it. And then the whole thing we've constructed around it with the materials and a whole community of schools have subscribed to that. And it's an ongoing journey. We're still just getting going in a way. But it's been a real... I don't know, a new sort of lease of life for me, because it's meant that I can do stuff slightly differently, and the whole connection with schools is very, very vivid, because a lot of the schools have bought into this materials, and then I work really closely with them. I do most of my days I'm talking to schools about how to deliver the content of the walkthroughs in their school, and I love that. So it's like a real bridge between the ideas and actual practice through the books.
Yeah, so alongside, so there's the books themselves, in the very vanishingly small chance that anybody listening hasn't heard of them. Can you just give like a very short summary of what the walkthroughs are? Yeah,
so basically they're a visual guide to some core teaching techniques and ideas. And in each book, we cover about 50 teaching strategies, including sort of behaviour, curriculum, questioning, and some of the Mode B things we talked about earlier. But we also have some summaries of some key research papers, and also some summaries of some key methods for implementing the ideas in a CPD system. So it's like a sort of guide, and we call it a guide for instructional coaching, because eventually we hope it will influence people to move more into a coaching model. But that's what it is. So each page is a spread of 5 steps to explain a questioning technique, or what did Arthur Shimamura say, or what did Dan Winningham say, or a retrieval practice technique. And I've done the short paragraphs of text, and Oliver has done the graphic illustration. So it's a visual thing, so you can imagine teachers doing it. And that's what it is. And it's they're sort of colourful and highly sort of designed so that they're engaging to visually, and they just provide a framework for teachers to have conversations about teaching, basically.
Yeah, it is a beautifully designed thing. I'm just scrolling through it now on my Kindle on my phone. It's a really attractive looking book. Can I just ask about the 5 steps thing? Why did you decide to do each of them as a 5-step process?
It's funny actually, because there's this fantastic book called Fred the Gardener, which Oliver's got from like 1940s, and it's like a book of how to do gardening, and it's almost exactly the same size as the walkthroughs, and each of the gardening steps is in this 5 things. So he must have had that in his head, but when we met, we started saying, when we first had our meeting to plan the walkthroughs, we talked about some steps and how many steps there should be, and there's just something about the double page A5 opening and having symmetry, where you sort of have an introduction and then some steps, and 5 just works. You've got 3 panels on each side, and we just thought, would that work? Could you describe everything in 5 steps? So we rehearsed a few, and I was thinking, that really works actually, because it's not too many. Like if you have 6, 7, 8 steps, it's too many, and some things it's just hard to describe in 3 steps. So we thought 5 that would have a repetitive pattern, so you've got a familiarity on each page, and it just as a discipline in some cases to describe a procedure in 5 steps. It just seems to work.
Yeah. I mean, it really does. It's fascinating. And so Walkthroughs 2 has come out. And did you say that you're going to take this further? Have you got ideas for further walkthroughs? Yeah,
we've got Walkthroughs 3. We right from the beginning, we said there would be 3 volumes, because we knew that one wasn't enough. And then once we explored the second one, we thought, gosh, there's actually more than for two. So we thought, well, we don't want to make a massive book. We'll just see how it goes. So we did one, and then we just decided what to go into volume 2. So next year we'll have written, by this time next year, we'll have volume 3 will be out, and that'll be it. And we've decided not to keep doing them, because then you're just sort of defeating the object of a simple compendium of ideas. There'll just be 3 volumes, each of which kind of builds on the other. So they'll work together or individually, and hopefully, that will be that. But then what we're going to keep on doing is working on the relationship with all the schools who have the materials, and more and more ideas are coming. Like we're working on a big mapping at the moment with walkthroughs and the early careers framework, for example, which Emma Turner, who is a primary specialist, is working on with us, and so they're very sort of spin-off projects from it rather than more books.
Yeah. So alongside the book, so schools is it a subscription model where schools sort of sign up to like a support package for like a year or a year or more? How does that work?
Well, it's basically, we call it subscription because we weren't sure what else to call it, but essentially you buy access to slide decks that go with each walkthrough and videos and various tools that we've devised. But once you have them forever. They're not. You don't have to keep paying. And so there's the first volume. Yeah, so that's basically what people do. They get access to a website where they can access all the resources that we have there to use. The slides, for example, play on your phone, or you can project them as a training tool. And there are short videos I've made to explain all the walkthroughs, and people can watch those. And there are some sort of documents that people can write in reflections and use it for their coaching conversation. So it's like a toolkit for running CPD and coaching systems in schools, which allows them to have kind of conversations around the school which are all linked and with a common language, rather than all sort of disparate and based on what people think they remember from the training day kind of thing.
Yeah, I like it. And so you go to lengths to explain that this is not, you're not saying like this is a rigid 5-step process for how to do X, Y, or Z, but it's like a starting point. Like you say, so you were talking about it as a frame for supporting instructional coaching. Yeah.
So on all the pages in every book it says ADAPT, and we developed this ADAPT acronym, which we were quite pleased with because it's one of the letters spells is A for ADAPT. So basically we're saying we don't want it to be a load of checklists, but we want it to be like a structured guide to the idea. So lots of different teachers can take that idea and say, okay, but in my situation it's like this, and in my situation it's like this, but without constantly deviating so far from the original thing that it becomes meaningless. So ADAPT is an important idea, that you take an idea and make it your own. And we encourage people to do that all the time. In fact, you just have to make any idea work, really. So that's an important principle for us, that the walkthroughs sort of are like a core nucleus kind of definition from which you then springboard and make sense of. Yeah, so and coaching is something which I think is gaining in currency across the system. People are starting to think our sort of SLT, learning walks and feedback and formal observation process maybe not the best way, and maybe coaching and is a better way, and we're encouraging people to move in that direction.
Right, I thought that concludes my my examination of your publishing career to date. Fascinating, and I'm looking forward to seeing where this takes you next. Let's put a pause in this for now, and as you know, we like to find out about the guests on the Rethinking Education podcast, and I'm really interested to hear about your own childhood, your own experience of school and later education. So. What are your memories of your childhood, and what was your experience of school? What kind of a student were you?
Oh, it's interesting because I don't know. I had quite like everyone, I suppose, has slightly different experiences. I started off living abroad. That was probably quite an informative process. So I lived abroad in different countries until I was 9, I think, or 8. So the first few years of my life were my parents were connected to the British Council, and we lived in Ethiopia and then Iran and then Brazil. And so that was it. So I went to primary school, went to the British school in Rio for a couple of years.
Right.
So I remember learning to speak French there. I had French lessons in this class and there. So that's an interesting thing. So when coming back into England in 1974, it was sort of going to secondary school was a slightly strange kind of experience. And so at primary school,
I imagine it's not going to be the same as Rio.
No, but it was interesting. It was like a new sort of setup, and quite a significant thing that happened to me at primary school. So I was moved up a year, which is a very odd thing to happen, but that is quite a big influence. And so, roughly equivalent of sort of being in year 6, because I'm without getting too boring about it. It was schools changed from year 7 to year 8, so secondary school started in year 8 in those days. So it's a bit like I was in year 6 and I was put into year 7 halfway through the year. So I had this feeling, I had this experience of suddenly being, of all my friends being in the year below me, and then going to secondary school and not really knowing anybody, and that was quite strange. But so always feeling like I was a slightly nerdy, spotty person, because that's kind of how it was kind of seen. Like,
So, what was the reason that you were moved up?
It was weird. I mean, the whole group of us took these IQ tests at school, so it was like a bit of a 70s thing, and there were 2 of us were regarded as sort of problem children because we were sort of seen as sort of freakishly out of kilter with the rest of the cohort. So they thought the best way to deal with us was to put us up a year. And we discussed it as a family, and I at the time I think I was quite excited about it. But I don't think socially it helped us particularly. Took me a few years to kind of really adjust to not feeling slightly younger than everyone, even though it's only a few months out in terms of birth time. But that sort of feeling of being slightly in the wrong place, but kind of able to do the work. So it was interesting, and I guess in the end it made me. So I was always young. So I went to university when I was 17. I was teaching. I had a full-time teaching job when I was 21. So I was quite young all the time, and I think that's why I was able to teach for so many years and still only be in my 50s. It's like, because I started right at the beginning. So that I think that was always a very strong feeling I had all the time, that I was kind of younger than my peers,
Yeah, a previous guest, that same thing happened to Kath Murdoch. She got moved up a year when she was in primary school, and she hated it. She said that she sort of felt like a fish out of water, and that she felt like she was supposed to be really smart because she'd moved up a year. And so then if she was struggling with something... Oh, no, was it Kath? I think it might have been Rachel McFarlane. I think it was Rachel who, she was like, she really didn't like it because she felt like it sort of put a spotlight on her, and meant that she had to bury it if she ever found that she was really struggling with something. I don't know if you found something similar.
I didn't really. I mean, I loved school. I mean, secondary school, I loved it. I loved the intellectual challenge of it. And there was lots of bullying and stuff. I went to the local school, but it was, I live in Farnham in Surrey, so it's not exactly the mean streets, but it was a local comprehensive school.
I know Farnham. Yeah. It's a nice leafy, it's a nice town.
But I still, threatened with 6-inch nail for a bag of crisps at lunchtime, that kind of stuff. So, I've had a few, times where I was punched off my bike, or, there was some times which was pretty rough, I felt. And some of the teaching methods were pretty intense, in terms of discipline but actually, there were some teachers in there who were just fantastic. So,
So what kind of a school was this?
It's a comprehensive school, 11 to 16. It still is a Wadham County High School in Farnham. It's a local comprehensive.
Right. Okay.
And they went to the sixth form. It's a sixth form college kind of environment there. So we just went to the sixth form college, and I really loved that. So sixth form college to me was really a great time because the diversity of people that you've met, and I enjoyed that. So for me, the academic side of school was always really great. But then you had other things on the side, like playing in bands and being involved in music. That was always something that was a big part of life. But but there are parts of the learning experience where it's really interesting now because I make a living writing and stuff, but I always find that in terms of maturation, so writing confidently, writing really intentionally well, I've always found it much harder, whereas maths and science was much easier for me to do well at, having been sort of accelerated. I always felt out of my depth in my English classes compared with other people because it was just a sophistication of language. So I felt like that. Probably if I'd stayed in the year below, I would have found English even more enjoyable and I'd have been better at it, probably.
Yeah, okay. And so you say that you went straight into teaching out of uni. What prompted that, and why is it that you didn't want to, or did you think about becoming, a working physicist?
I thought about it for a while. I mean, I was interested in my final year at university. I did this project on nuclear magnetic resonance, and I designed this sort of specification for a brain scanner. That was in those, and I was quite interested in that. But then, the only way I could continue that was to move to Birmingham and not Manchester. And I loved being in Manchester and I didn't want to leave. So I was trying to think, well, how could I stay in Manchester for a bit longer? And then I saw this leaflet which said you could do a PGCE and get 1,500 quid extra to do physics or maths. And I thought, well, okay, I'll do that for a year and then I'll see how I feel, because it would be something to do and I get paid a bit more to be a student. So I did it. And then when I did it, I actually enjoyed it. So I thought, well, I might as well do a job. I teach for a bit. And then when I actually got a job teaching, I really loved it. I loved being a sixth form. So that's the way it worked. It was kind of just a way of staying in Manchester and doing other things I was enjoying there, like being involved in music and stuff. And then I went to this sixth form college in Wigan, which is just about reachable from Manchester. And I just had the best time. They said, in my interview, they said, okay, you can teach physics. That's great. What else can you do? Like, what would be your elective? What would be your extracurricular thing? Because it's in the timetable. It's not after school. It's like timetabled in. So I said, I don't know, I could do bands or bridge video stuff. And they said, okay, I'll have to do both of those. So it was on my timetable to do music production and video production as well as physics. I loved that. So I used to every week teach kids how to use a recording studio. And I used to teach kids how to make videos with editing and stuff. It was great, and that was on my timetable in the day. It was a real blessing. So I used to do physics, maths, and then video production or something. And that to me I learned a lot from doing that. Some fantastic experiences of doing that. So that was a really nice job to start off with.
Yeah. And so did you ever take a break from teaching, or did you then stay as a teacher for the next, whatever it was, nearly 30 years or something?
I took a 1 year break. So after 3 years, I was only 24, but I'd already been teaching 3 years. And I was thinking, I don't just want to do this the rest of my life. And I wanted to go backpacking. So me and my partner at the time, we went off traveling for a year and we did that. And that was great. So, and we spent literally a whole year traveling in Southeast Asia and China and stuff, going on the Trans-Siberian train from Beijing to Moscow in 1991. Absolutely fantastic. It was just that.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Just after the wall had come down.
Totally, yeah. I mean, we were arriving to Moscow where a ruble was, you could get like 50 rubles for $1. So you were you could buy bottles of champagne for about 80p and stuff. It was just absolutely ludicrous. So those were sort of amazing times. But then we came back into London and thought, right, I need to get back to work. So I became a supply teacher and then got started working at Holland Park School and stuff. But that was a return, yeah. So but it was always just I kind of at one point thought I fancied working for the BBC or something, but that was just too hard to get into. And then teaching was there. And once I got into Holland Park, I just loved that place. It was just a magical kind of time with all the team of people that I worked with, and I just loved the whole thing of working in a school with challenges and the whole sort of social aspect of that in terms of working with children and feeling part of something that really mattered. I loved it. So from then I knew I was just going to stay in teaching, because I thought Holland Park taught me about kind of what really it was all about. Before that, it was just about teaching physics, but then the whole wider context became very vivid when I was at Holland Park.
So as you know, I'm really interested in this idea of significant learning, which is an idea that I first came across in the writings of Carl Rogers, the person-centered, the guy who invented counseling, essentially psychotherapist, and he talked about significant learning as being, learning that changes you in some way, that shapes the behavior of the individual or shapes how you think of yourself or how you think of the world. Learning that's, again, it's like this more expansive idea than the kinds of learning that we often talk about within the context of schools. And so I'd be interested to hear whether there are any moments, and it sounds like Holland Park might be one of them. It sounds like you were potentially about to start talking about that then. Well, can you think of any particular sort of moments that have really shaped your thinking along the way? And this could be outside of education. This could be, about your thinking about life, the universe and everything. Or it could be, that's really shaped your thinking about teaching and learning.
Well, there are lots of ones. I mean, I suppose arriving at Holland Park, what we found there was that we were in this period which was emerging from the 80s, which had gone very kind of focused on social justice and so on, which wasn't a bad thing in Ilia at the time. But it was a group of young teachers in Holland Park. We felt we were.
Sorry, just quickly. So Ilia is the Inner London Education Authority.
That's right.
Is that right?
Yeah.
You're right. Okay. So go on.
So we were slightly shocked by some of the attitudes around us from some of the teachers who'd been there a while, where everything seemed to be about children. People would actually say things like how would you like it if you took a test and you couldn't do well? How would that make you feel? And we were thinking, this is so patronising, and there was this feeling that the school was getting, at the time that we were there, when I first arrived there, I think the figures were 17% of children got 5 GCSEs or more, like 17% above a C. And it was very, very, middle class children were not going to that school, except in very small numbers. And those people were sort of parents who felt like they were warriors, they were sort of social justice warriors who were putting their children into this tough school environment because of their beliefs. But they weren't being taught very well. It was actually like sink or swim. And sometimes you'd hold there were children there who were socially isolated because they were not able. And we just felt that the expectations of the children were just appallingly low.
And was this within a sort of a very like laissez-faire, like permissive, progressive, sort of like and was this something that was part of that wider thinking in Ilia at the time, would you say?
I think it was part of a kind of a need for people to feel like there was this sort of. We used to say that the school was sort of 90% ethos, 10% achievement, because it almost like it doesn't matter if the kids do well or not, as long as they've sort of all bonded together and had this comprehensive experience. But it was so overblown, and we were saying that it's not even happening. Look at the playground; they're not all sort of mingling in some lovely hot, melting pot of communities mixing. You've got those Moroccan kids over there who are beating the crap out of those Afro-Caribbean kids over there, and it's attritional, it's brutal, and there's lots of fights, and it's violent, and the kids aren't doing any homework, and so that was really instruction. So there was a wave of people saying we need to get on top of this, and actually it felt like there's a whole group of us at the time who were saying, we have to be much more disciplined about learning, about outcomes, about assessment, about standards, and that was the journey we were on. Sort of changing, sort of saying that the values and ethos are great, but not at the expense of the achievement. And yes, it does matter if they pass their exams. So but so much time was mopped up in dealing with really tough day-to-day social deprivation. It was really incredible. So. There was a boy called Leon in my tutor group, my first ever tutor group. It was a year 7 tutor. He had been brought up by his grandma because his mum died in childbirth, and she was illiterate, and he was 11. And I remember him; he was the angriest young man I've ever met, and sometimes he'd cry so hard, because his life was so tough. It's well up just even remembering it,
Wow.
And it's like. Stuff like that, you think, you don't come across kids like that. How can you not be able to read when you're 11 and be so angry? And I met so many children who were just so angry.
Yeah.
And so that shapes you. Think, God, we've got to do something for these kids. And part of it is not just sort of putting our arms around them and saying, hey guys, you're going to be fine. It's like we need to teach them. We need to teach them properly.
Teach them how to read.
Yeah. So there are so many, and all of us, we used to go to the pub on Friday nights, and because the whole experience of being there was so intense, you just be absolutely shredded, by this emotional roller coaster of kids who are living through violence and bring it into the school. It was like, whoa! Friday nights were just like, bloody hell, thank God. And that's what it was like. So it was very bonding. You felt like you were really in the thick of it, like the sharpest end you could imagine. That's what it felt like then. And so that to me was very formative. How do you get kids who have this? And then weirdly in that school, you had kids who came like from embassies. So you had these sort of lovely A-level students who came from like the Ukrainian embassy or something, who were just really good at maths. And so you did have this sort of melting pot feeling. So it wasn't like that. It was like that every minute of the day. But so trying to morph the school into something which was achievement focused, that had a coherence to it, was demanding. So you learned so much from that.
Yeah, it's amazing. So I mean, you're painting a picture of something that sounds like a really difficult, challenging place to work, and yet it seems like you found it more sort of like exhilarating, and that it was actually energizing. And so you were saying that there was a group of you within the school who were saying, actually, we need to ramp up, what we're doing for these kids. And so, were you a part of a sort of a reform process that then happened at that school?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I think we were. I mean, it wasn't really just me, but it felt like at the time I was arriving, quite a few changes were coming into place, and some leadership people were there who were changing things quite rapidly. But we didn't have like behaviour management systems. It was brutal. So you like really felt like you were on your own in the class. Just there was no one to refer to. There was no on-call system. You couldn't get help if the kids were sort of destroying you or anything. It was quite isolating in that way. So we had to things like behaviour management systems hadn't been invented yet. So we had, and also, but then just things like GCSE stuff was starting to sort of kick in a way which hadn't been there before. I just felt there was a whole lot of changes which were positive. And even I got a job as a head of year, so it was my first sort of really proper leadership role. And the person I took over from, I was asking her about attainment data. She said, attainment data? What's that got to do with us? And I said, isn't that the job? She said, God, no, you haven't got time for that. You'd be too busy just phoning up to make them come into school, and it's all about attendance. And I was thinking, okay, God, but I just wanted to find out what their scores were. And so I busied myself talking to heads of department, and I felt that was a really important thing to do and not see that as outside of my remit at all. And I loved that. I loved this sort of feeling of owning having a responsibility for 240 is huge. 240 children in year 7 and in 10 tutor groups, and trying to feel like I was their kind of key custodian in the school to marshal them through. And I loved it. It's an amazing opportunity. I loved it. It's like running a little school, but then you had all these teachers to talk to, and the intellectual challenge and the emotional challenge of that was massively rewarding, but not easy.
Yeah, I can see. So this, and how long were you there for?
I was there for 7 years.
Right.
And then,
okay.
And then by that time, and then I got a job as the deputy head of setting up a new school in Haringey. So that was like I wanted to take everything I'd learned from Oliver Park and say, right, we're going to start a new school. So I was appointed to be the deputy head of a brand new school in Haringey, which opened on the 9th, 99. We were very proud of that in September 99. And it was great. I was only like early 30s, but I was deputy head. And because it was just year 7, I learned so much. So I had to teach, had to be the network manager, had to be in charge of behaviour as well as the curriculum and do the timetable. And I had to do everything alongside the head. So I loved it. It was just another great job.
Yeah. Okay. So it sounds like you're talking about significant moments of significant learning. just the whole progression of your career is sounding like it would fall into that. Are there any other sort of key moments that you think stand out? You said earlier that there are many that you can think of.
Well, I mean, I suppose. Well, there are so many. I mean, I think one of the things I learned at Holland Park was that it is possible to deal with children with all sorts of different backgrounds and motivate them to work hard. But the challenge is around managing people. So the whole thing of ethos and systems and all of that having to go together. So I learned a lot about that from a kind of leadership point of view. And then going into the new school, there was this feeling of being able to start fresh each time, but even then inducting new teachers into the system all the time. But I suppose this sort of idea of teaching to the top had really come to me. Like what I learned at Holland Park was you have to pitch it up. You've got these children who are coming to our school expecting to be challenged. And the worst thing you can do is make them feel like they're under-challenged. And that was the feedback we had. So you had all these parents who were wanting the school to succeed, wanting the school to be great, but they were saying that they would sometimes show you, as a head of year, you'd pick this up, and then temporarily, I was short-term, I was an assistant head there as well. And people would say, look, this isn't great. Look at what you're doing. This is my child. This is their education. And it's just not good enough. And you'd think, no, it isn't. So that thing of expectations being low and the teachers being the ones allowing their expectations to drop because of the challenges they face sort of towards the lower end, convinced me that you have got to pitch it up. And that's what we went into. So the reason I love working with Ros Hudson, who's the head at Alexandra Park School, was that we both had exactly the same attitude. It's absolutely sky-high expectations, pitch it up, books which are challenging, curriculum which is challenging, and that's the goal. It's a constant mission to push students. And I really think that's important, that sense of it matters. We're on a mission, and children shouldn't be allowed to underachieve because our expectations are too low. So I think that probably that's what Holland Park taught me more than anything else, is that it's just not okay to allow people to just say, oh, poor kids, they're a bit poor, let's just be a bit soft on them. It's just that we just be blood boilingly angry about some of the attitudes you'd have come across there from some teachers. They really just, and not, of course, that wasn't all of them, but there were people who literally explicitly say those sorts of things. And it was quite shocking.
Yeah. This is something that's come up again on the podcast before about, unconscious or sometimes actually explicitly conscious biases and low expectations that teachers have sometimes had for their young people. And they say, oh, that's all well and good, but not for these kids, these kids need something else. And sometimes it sort of comes from a good place. Sometimes they're saying like, we don't want to be imposing middle class values on working class kids and making out like it's all about going to university when we know that actually, that might not be in their future. And so you can sort of see where it can sometimes come from a good place, but you can also see how it can be quite pernicious. And this was one of the first ever blogs, I think, that I came across of yours, was talking about this idea. It's called Teaching and Gifted and Talented Provision, a Total Philosophy.
Yeah.
Because I was a gifted and talented coordinator for a while for my sins, and it was never a very well worked out policy agenda. It's just like the whole idea of creating special provision for gifted and talented kids, which was defined as like the top 10% performing. It just seemed like it wasn't ever very well thought out, and nobody could ever really explain even what they meant, like what is gifted and what is talented and what's the difference. I would hear like 100 different explanations for that, and I never got to the bottom of it. And your blog was one of the first things that I sort of thought, yeah, I can get behind this. You were talking about, gifted and talented. It's like, it's about setting a standard and making it so that everybody can meet that, so differentiation isn't like differentiating down and just giving some kids without filling the blanks to do.
Yeah.
Right. When other kids are doing, extended writing, it's like, what support do each of you need to reach this standard?
Exactly. And I feel like that was partly reflecting my own experience at school, like the thing of being moved up a year and so on, that you feel like, it did that work in itself, because that sort of like if I'm in the right sort of stream or band, then I'll be sorted. But actually, that doesn't necessarily work. You have to be taught in a certain way, And so I agree with this whole G&T thing, and I still think it's something we're working through as a system. You don't want special treats for children who are because they're high attaining. You want that to be for everybody, but at the same time, there is a divergent range of attainment by a certain point. But there are some things that some students are able to access, and shouldn't they therefore have the opportunity to do that? So I feel like it is quite complicated. But the way I always think of it is, like you say, there's a whole culture of celebrating excellence and never saying kids are sort of nerdy or whatever. It's all about celebrating intellectual curiosity as being a good thing. But then you have to have some set piece opportunities which are allowing certain students to be more independent, perhaps. So because otherwise it is just difficult. I mean, I think the ideal is important, but then the reality is teaching a whole range of students at the same time is complex. So you have to have a range of ways of meeting the needs of those higher attaining students. But I do think as a parent, you're entitled for your child who's highly, who's very knowledgeable and high attaining to go to a school at any place and never feel held back. I really think that's an important thing. And if there's any sense that they're kind of waiting for everyone else to catch up with them and treading water, then that's not fair on them, and they shouldn't have to have that experience. So teachers need to be bolder about allowing children to push ahead, and that's sometimes hard for teachers to kind of deal with. I used to say this to teachers, in my schools, like, imagine being the teacher who, when the kid comes home from school, is saying, "Oh God, it's so boring, and their lesson is so easy." Why would you want to be that teacher? So find out who those children are, and then stretch the hell out of them, and so they love you, and they say, "Oh, I love that teacher; it's so interesting." You want those. That's what you want those kids to think of you. So make sure that you are that teacher, and that is definitely within teachers' power.
Yes, yeah. Thank you. Is there anything else while we're on significant learning? Are there any sort of key moments that you think have really, been pivotal for you or have shaped you in some way?
I think there have been some moments around aspects to do with behaviour management and stuff where I've had like some really, really bad experiences with that, and feeling like there's a whole emotional aspect to behaviour management which I feel is under discussed at schools, and we're sort of almost not supposed to have those feelings. But I think they're all different sorts of people, and as a person, just from growing up at school and then becoming a teacher, some teenagers and the way they interface with you can be brutalizing. And I do feel like I always get absolutely furious with people who are negative about behavior management systems which allow teachers to feel relaxed, safe, confident, and teach, and children feel the same, even though they're a bit sort of don't like the sound of it, when actually without those things, teachers would be being brutalized every day, children would be anxious about going to school, and there's a lot of horrible low-level bullying and disruption going on day after day after day. And that is a reality. And some people who I think, you've never worked in a school like that, have you? You don't know what it's like. And I actually think sometimes I go to some schools, I think, thank God you guys are here, because look at you in that class, which is tough, and you're doing the business, and thank God you've got that behaviour system backing you up, which you appreciate. And people are saying, oh, they shouldn't be like that, have no idea. And I really think that. I've had that experience of being someone who was like absolutely ruined by classes and not knowing what the hell to do about it and not knowing who to turn to and feeling like it was like a failure of my part. But actually you think, no, I shouldn't have to feel like this. And I feel that's true of lots of teachers. Like it's sort of, they're put up, there's too much pressure put on them to be superhuman emotionally in the face of some quite demanding situations, including sort of, and I don't just, sometimes it's just like just getting the class to listen kind of feeling like that's, but sometimes it's actually threats and violence as well. And I don't want to exaggerate that, but I've had 4 or 5 very dangerous incidents in my time where I actually thought I was going to get stabbed or and stuff like that. And you think, God Almighty, this is the proper front line. It really is. This isn't a game.
Yeah. I have also worked in schools like that have been, very challenging behaviourally. Kids shouting at you to F off, squaring up to you when you can see that they've lost it. Sometimes they're towering over you and you think, oh, actually, this is really not okay. and you report it, and the kid's back in your lesson that afternoon, sort of thing. And it's horrendous, that sense that you're sort of powerless when teachers are being undermined by senior leaders, when they're not believed, or they're sort of sometimes undermined in front of the kids. Like it's like the opposite of it's not even like that there's no behavior system, it's like there's just a really unhelpful one. So I totally hear what you're saying, and I agree. Lots of the people who talk about we should have no exclusions and so on. It's easy to say, and of course the word exclusion is a heightened emotive word, but you're right. When you've worked in those very challenging circumstances, you can see the need for discipline and for systems, and sometimes to remove kids from lessons and to remove them from schools. And that's a really hard thing to do, isn't it? I'd be interested to hear, I don't know if you're happy to talk about this, but so because I remember reading about when you went to, was it called Highbury Grove, the school in North London? And I remember reading about, like, you were sort of bringing in a behaviour management system there that was, trying to sort of to get on top of behaviour. What was your experience with that?
Yeah, I mean, it's still, it's one of these things where it was hard. I mean, I if I'd known a school needed that sort of a level of behaviour management system, I don't think I would have chosen to go there. But I kind of was under the impression it wasn't like that. And I don't know why, and I was kind of kidding myself probably, but I wouldn't have nominated myself to be, I'm the person to run a difficult behaviour system. But it was evident to me that it was needed because, I mean, I remember we introduced some basic rules around some lesson behaviours and so on. And I remember this geography teacher saying to me, well, I remember one day talking to some children in the corridor, and they said, and I was just in my first couple of weeks, and they said, well, sorry, it's good to talk to you, sir, but I'm supposed to be in lessons. And I just said, oh, God, I thought it was break because there were so many children on the corridor. I literally thought it was break time. and I thought, you're kidding. This is lesson time. And I thought, oh, my God, yes, it is. And then another teacher said that we introduced these sort of systems, and then he said there were these movement sensor switches for the lights in the corridor. And he said to me, do you know, the lights have gone off in the corridor for the first time, and I've been here for 3 years. I didn't know they did that because it meant that there were so many children on the corridor the whole time that they'd never gone off because there was always movement and stuff like that. It was like, but the problem was that it was the scale. We hadn't quite got on top of it. So you'd have a sort of detention system where so many things would trigger a detention, but then you end up with like a couple hundred kids in detention. It's like literally you think, bloody hell. So even in my sort of feeling I needed to do this, I don't think I ever got to the point. I was only there 2 years, but it was just we were in that process of working out what the right balance was of strict and absolute and no excuses, and there's a trigger which would leave us some improvement, and then hitting the wall of children who just couldn't cope with that and were then like bouncing around and exclusions being an issue, and we're trying to like resolve all this stuff and deal with some very needy children who we just didn't know what to do with them. So there were children who you think they're only in year 8, so they're not sort of malicious. But where are we going to put them? Because they literally can't sit in a class. I mean, they come out of the class the whole time. They just walk out. They disrupt the lesson constantly when they're in there. So we put them in a small unit, but then how long for? And then who with? Because if they're in with these sort of very shy children who are also got there because of learning needs, then they disrupt that learning as well. So we had like about 8 or 10 children in year 7 and 8 who just felt like, where do these children go in the system? Because they don't qualify for special school. They're not right. They're not going to permanently exclude them and go to the PRU. We just couldn't find the right provision, and they were so different in their needs. And so we were wrestling with this constantly of this sort of tension of high volume detentions, and then that was kind of quite attritional to follow up. And then we have this whole issue of if they decide not to go to the detention, what do you do? Honestly,
yeah.
And actually, I mean, I know this, that people who are still involved in that, it's just the issues are still the same, and the same social pressures are there, the same dynamics of very, very wealthy families mixing in with children who are like uber deprivation all in one melting pot. It means you've got so many competing voices sort of shouting at you saying, I want the school to be all liberal and fun, and now you've killed the joy. And other people are saying it's still really dangerous, and I'm scared, I'm not feeling safe on the corridors. And it's like, oh God, so do we lock the school down? Do we free it up? And I just was constantly wrestling with that, and didn't manage to resolve it in time for the school to feel like it has moved on. But those problems were already there when I arrived. It was just that,
yeah,
so that's a tough scenario. So I'm very sympathetic to anyone who runs a very tight ship with a strong discipline, and the kids are learning, and the teachers feel safe and happy. And I think if you've managed to do that, I almost don't care how, because total respect to you, that's what you've had to do, and you didn't take that decision lightly, and you did something I wasn't able to do. So good for you, and that's how I feel about it. And so don't get in the way of someone who's trying to do that, I would say to anybody, even if you're slightly uncomfortable with some of the choices that had to be made. They trust those people, they had to make those choices.
Yeah. I mean, this gets so much heat, doesn't it, online, and you can see why. And it's it's so hard to do what you were trying to do, because you were coming into an existing school where the kids were behaving habitually in ways. For example, when the bell goes, you don't have to go to your lesson. They'd learned that behavior, and that had become a norm for them. And the teachers were used to working in that way. And if you start with a new school, like in year 7 that you were talking about, and everybody's on board with this new way of working, and everybody agrees that they're going to do things in a particular way, and they've been recruited with that in mind, and the kids and the parents already know, then it's going to be so much easier to establish a new way of doing things. But when you go into a school where we see these headlines every September, don't we? And then people are mocking it and saying, head teacher is hauled over the coals for having school rules, and sometimes it seems arbitrary, doesn't it? I remember, like at my school, the top button, like having your top button done up was a thing, and it sort of just felt like just a bit like, why drawing the line there? You can understand why why those decisions are made sometimes. You're like, if the conversation is about doing your top button up, it's not about the fact that you're throwing chairs around, or the fact that you're it's like the broken windows theory, isn't it?
One of the things that in terms of behaviorism that I've found works is late is late, and a late is an automatic sanction. So if you're late to a class, you have a detention, and that mops up 90% of kind of casual, sloppy punctuality, because the kids don't want a detention, so they just make sure they're on time, and it just works, and it does, because it then develops the habit. We're always on time, and we don't push it to the limit, because what's the point of being 10 seconds late and getting a detention? You just make sure you're on time. You self-regulate, and it becomes a habit. And that's not draconian. You don't want each teacher every lesson going, oh, just about late, where you late, and making a choice. You're just saying the bell's gone, you're late, that's it. And there's a clarity there, and the children respond to that, except like 5 children who don't. So you have to deal with them. But the fact that the majority do is very, very important. It just changes the culture. So those sorts of absolutes, I think, are useful. But I think there are some subtleties around that. And for me, one of the biggest issues I still sort of have cold sweats about is trying to do too many agendas at once. So one of the examples I'll give you is, we're trying to be sort of super sound in a way which is totally sincere around, say, LGBTQ and transgender awareness and so on. And so we wanted to have toilets which are sort of gender neutral, and that was lobbied for by a qualities group that we had of student led, with some teacher representation, and they presented this to the SLT and said that we want to have gender neutral toilets. And so we thought, yeah, why not? I mean, how could you stand in the way of that? But then what happened is that we didn't have the behaviour culture ready to accept that. And so we had this idea that it was a cool thing to do, a good thing to do, a right thing to do. But we didn't have the behaviour culture embedded enough to sustain it. So what happened is that in those toilets, you started getting behaviours which you needed sort of almost totally constant teacher supervision, because the students weren't used to it, and they hadn't accepted it as a community. And so you'd have inappropriate behaviour. And I think I should have been able to say, I like the idea, but we're just not ready for it yet. When I didn't say that, I was too hasty to say, oh yeah, I want that. That sounds great. We should be doing the right thing. And that type of decision, you feel like you've got competing agendas. I haven't got the capacity in the staff to supervise that toilet all day long. I just don't. And so I've created a toilet which for some children feel unsafe in that, which previously they didn't.
Yeah.
Just so that say, hey, look at us, we've got transgender toilets, transgender or gender neutral toilets. I even used the language wrong there, but you know what I mean. And there were some trans kids in the school, and I didn't make their lives any better. I made them worse. So that's no good, is it? It's like, so you're sort of trying to fumble your way through things, and I just think I was trying to do too many things at once, trying to be too clever probably, and just shouldn't have even. You know what I mean? You just need to be more measured and steady with some of these things. And I think I was too rushing into sort of change the curriculum, try to do this, try to do that. And all of it was a bit of, in the end, a bit of a jumble of too many agendas and none of them really kind of absolutely hitting home yet. So it didn't all kind of sing together in the time that I was there.
I see. Yeah. It's interesting. And there's classic leadership lessons in there, I think.
Yeah.
And what was that book by Vivian Robinson about like reduce change to increase improvement or something like that?
Yeah.
I think there's some wisdom in that. And like you say, it would be really hard to meet with that equalities group in the senior team who put together a really, thoughtful presentation and then say, sorry, not at the moment. Like it would be a tough call to make that. And you can see how this can easily sort of, and that's on a larger scale. The same sort of thing can happen within the classroom, can't it? Where the teacher's saying yes to too many things. And
then in terms of like, I remember this. It makes me laugh, but it's kind of not funny really. But I remember this year 8 boy showing some parents round for an open evening, and we had introduced these gender neutral toilets, and he said he was showing his parents around, and he stood in front of these toilets, and he said, "Yeah, because it's all right if you're gay and everything in our school, because we've got special toilets for you." I was like, "Oh God,
not our message.
We're not." There's so many issues with that, what you just said there. But he means well, we meant well, but we're stuffing it up. This isn't working. We need to get our language right. And, it's like you think, oh, okay. And the parents were good. They were sort of saying, I can see what you're trying to do there. But that wasn't quite what we needed to hear. But anyway.
Right, so it seems like we've merged it into the Rethinking Education part of the conversation, which is great. Essentially, there's 3 sort of headings that we organise this part of the discussion under: positives, challenges, and fixes. So let's start with positive stuff. What do you see in your travels? And I know that you now that things are opening up again, you've already been out and about. I saw that you were all over the country this week. What do you see happening when you're out and about in these schools that you think is brilliant and really positive and that you're really excited about and that you would like to boost the signal of or see more of?
I think there's the whole engagement of teachers with thinking about evidence and research and just ideas that have come through from cognitive science and some other things. Just that general level engagement and people reflecting on what learning there is and how to do it better. For me, that's just amazing. I mean, it's nothing like what it was like when I started teaching. It's like a world away. So the fact that the community of teachers, fueled by social media and that sense of on a national scale, teachers are able to communicate. I feel that's incredible. I think it's the best time there's ever been to be a teacher in that regard. It's dynamic, it's buzzy, there are inspiring people all over. And I just think it's a great atmosphere and a collective spirit, which I find constantly inspiring. I love it. So I find that all the time, even though some of the challenges are real and you could argue about certain government policies or whatever, the fact that I think the teaching profession is incredibly dynamic in England. And I say in England because that's the system that we're talking about. And to the point where it's looked to from outside. So whenever you talk to international schools and so on, they're always sort of taking people from England to sort of bring those ideas in. It's not like we're importing ideas too many from outside, and that's coming from within the profession rather than at a policy level. So I think that's just absolutely sensational. And the other thing I'm really excited to see is leadership culture shifting towards sort of or shifting away from kind of accountability-driven systems towards more putting staff first and instructional coaching and this sort of investment in people kind of approach, which I find really great to see. So I see that more and more. The fact that we're, if you go back to, say, late 2000s, graded observations, lots of top-down initiatives, and all that kind of stuff. I think there's schools where that's just, and loads of marking and all that kind of stuff. Now you've got schools where the marking load has gone down, the assessment load has gone down, they've got coaching going on, they've got loads of CPD, and I just think that's also exciting to see. So those two things for me go together, but I just feel like how great to come into the profession at this time and be entering when all that stuff is happening.
Yeah, I agree. And when you look at the appalling figures around like teacher retention, there's a lot of ex-teachers in this country, and I can't remember what the statistics are, but it's something like, is it about 50% of teachers leave within the first 5 years? It's not good. And the two things that they most often cite are behaviour and workload. And I wonder whether that's, this is going to turn it around. Like you're saying, that the workload and, people having lots of schools are moving away from very onerous written marking policies, and they're working in these places where behaviour systems are, more well established, and teachers feel free to teach their lessons, and there's less of that sort of conflict and thinking, like you say, when you're working in a school that doesn't have those systems and the kids are all piling in late, and you think, I'm just going to make work for myself if I'm going to set them all a detention, and then, like you say, follow it up if they don't turn up, and you're on the phone and you're like, life's too short. And so you just sort of, it's very easy to get overwhelmed, and you can see why it is that so many teachers vote with their feet. So I wonder whether you see any early signs of this. Do you get a sense that these twin sort of agendas that you're talking about might help to turn the tide in terms of teacher retention?
I think so. I think the statistics are more like, I think you could probably look this up, but I think it's something like 60. It used to be like 71, 72% retention after 5 years. Now it's more like 67%. It's like it is going down. And that's the sort of level. When I feel like now, I'm hearing anecdotally of schools where they're getting like 30, 40, 50 applicants for a job to teach history in a secondary school, that kind of thing, in some areas. So I do think it's harder to get into teaching. You're hearing of NQTs who can't find, sort of a teacher training placements who can't find permanent jobs and stuff. And I sort of think that's not great for them individually, but as a system, it's a good thing, because it means there's more competition for places, which means that there must be more people coming into the profession, and so you've got a higher threshold of selection. And I think those sorts of things are maybe, I don't know if that's a trend, it's so hard to tell. So I can't really tell. I know that some teachers, some individual schools report to me, like I asked them, some of the schools I work with, they definitely have had lower turnover than they've had in previous years because of certain things that they've introduced. So turnover isn't necessarily within schools. It isn't necessarily always a negative. Sometimes people move on for opportunities and stuff. So, but
yeah, it's a good thing.
It is a good thing. But I feel it's hard to know, isn't it? There's data. There's probably you've got your anecdotal feeling of it, but then there's going to be some evidence out there. But I feel like, I don't know. There are other reasons. There are economic factors and stuff, aren't there, and which move people in and out of teaching, which can sometimes override the actual conditions in the schools.
Yeah, you're right. It might well be too soon to tell, because I think that these are quite recent developments. But I agree, the embrace of research and evidence, and leaders moving away from very sort of onerous top-down accountability, silly ideas like performance-related pay, and graded lesson observations are going out of fashion fast. And long may they remain in the basement of the Museum of Historical bad policies. Anything else in the positives column?
Well, I also think the whole movement around curriculum is just absolutely brilliant. I feel like I'm having some of the best conversations I've ever had with teachers, where we're talking about what to teach, why we teach it, how to make the curriculum have a kind of more diverse set of perspectives, which books should we read, more awareness of sort of vertical curriculum knowledge through a primary school. So they're starting to be aware of the science curriculum having a flow rather than just being the topics they were teaching. And the fact that people are asking you to say, can we do a session on science at Key Stage 2? Or there's a kind of appetite. Now, you could say it's driven by inspection, and sometimes it is, but I just think that's a growing trend. So I do these events called Curriculum Thinking Masterclasses that Mary Myatt and John Tomsett and I put together. And the demand for the tickets from those every time is absolutely ridiculous. It's like, wow, there's a first. People will hang off every word of Christine Council or Mary Myatt and lots of other people who we invite to join us, because they're so interested in this whole thing of the possibilities for the curriculum. And I think that's absolutely brilliant that people are having those conversations in a way which was not happening so widely before, probably. I don't think.
Yeah, I agree. While we're on curriculum, do you want to do a quick plug for the EduGive thing in October?
Oh, yeah, thank you. Yeah, so this is a thing I realised because of the demand for these events that we could use the idea to raise money. So working with my daughter, actually, who's a student, but we were trying to think of a fundraising way. And so we've set up an event on the 1st and 2nd of October called EduGive UK. And it's going to be sort of 25 to 30 webinars, which are sort of half an hour, 35 minutes long. Some will be live, some will be recorded. And you'll be able to get a package of videos of all of these webinars for £50, and all of that money will go to support Fair Share. So, and we're going to be sponsored by John Catt and some other people to sort of pay for the ticket fees and stuff. But so if you pay £50, you'll get 25 webinars of high quality CPD input for your school, and all of that money will go to Fair Share. So we're hoping to, I don't know, sell at least 500 tickets and raise £25,000 or maybe more. That's what we're trying to do.
Yeah, that would be amazing. And so Fair Share is the food poverty charity, isn't it? That Marcus Rashford has been very involved with around free school meals and holiday hunger and all that stuff.
Yeah, and we thought that would be it would be coming up to half term then, and it's the demand it's a big news last year. But like all these things, the issues are still there even after they've had their high profile moments. So already we've had loads of people sign up. We've got a great lineup of people talking, and we're still putting that together. But already we're selling tickets. So I think we've already raised £2,000, which I'm very excited about. It's great.
Yeah, it's wonderful. And I saw you did something similar off the back of all of the success with Rosenshine. I saw that you made a hefty donation to Fair Share previously, which was great that you were, you found yourself, riding this wave, but you wanted to spread some of it around.
Yeah, it was actually for Shelter. We did it for Shelter then. Yeah. So
that was right. Shelter.
I did two events, which were before lockdown, so they were in-person events, and all the money that the money we made went to Shelter. So we raised £10,000 for Shelter. That was great. Again, so once you get 100 people paying £100, that's like £10,000. I was thinking, okay, they're prepared to do that, so I'll give it to somebody, and because it's on the back of something which I kind of fluked into. So I felt like that was an appropriate thing to do.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Okay, so let's move into challenges. By the way, I'll put a link to the EduGive thing in the show notes in case anybody's interested. It's going to be a wonderful event. So let's move into challenges. What do you see as being the big fish? What do you think, given all of this very, healthy stuff that you've been talking about, what do you see as the major challenges that we face? And this could be, when I talk about these conversations, this could be at the level of policy, it could be at the level of, like classroom management, it could be somewhere in between, so we can take this in any direction that you want to take it in. But what do you see as the major things that we need to get right that we're not currently doing?
I think there are a couple of things. One of them is, I feel like our accountability structures aren't right, and I feel like our system in secondary education is too strongly orientated towards 16 students taking a total ton of exams and then going to something else, and so it's not aiming at the end. So I'm going to talk about solutions. I'm a big fan of the idea of having a baccalaureate aim to at 18, but I feel like we've got this structure which have lots of effects. It affects curriculum design lower down the school. It affects progression beyond it, and it creates this incredible kind of like volume of effort around the end of year 11, which I think is distorting and unhealthy because of the scale of it. But that doesn't mean I think exams in themselves are problematic or there shouldn't be exams. It's just that I think there are too many, and I think they're at the wrong point. So I think that's one thing. And also then there's an accountability culture beyond that through inspection and progress rate and data, which I think is also excessive. And I feel like our accountability system generally is excessively punitive and doesn't allow all schools to thrive. So I'd say one of the things I just think is an absolute and it's an outrage in our system. I really do, is that we grade schools inadequate, including their leaders and teachers in them. And I just think that the fact that we even use that language about people and schools is an atrocity. And when people justify it, I just think you're basically saying, let's put people's heads on a stick for public humiliation and be happy about it, because that's essentially what you do.
Yeah.
And I feel that the fact that we tolerate that in our system, that we have this idea that if you're not good enough, you deserve to be shamed up in front of everybody, is a bizarre and counterproductive. And it affects lots of other schools who are not even remotely close to that, because they're so afraid of the humiliation and the shame of being shown up in front of the whole community as being inadequate. They do all these perverse things to avoid that, which aren't necessarily even choices they would make otherwise, and they don't even need to be responding in that way. So for me, that we should be stripping that all away. If it was down to me, we wouldn't grade schools at all. We would have schools that were known by trusted professionals who were holding to them account through the discussion and pushing them to change or improve. But you wouldn't have this sort of public accountability in that way. You'd have reports to parents about what schools were doing, challenges they were experiencing, and solutions that are proposed, and you could give information to parents. But the idea that you can meaningfully line up school X in Somerset with school Y in Wakefield and say, we think they're roughly on a par against some scale. I just think it's the most ludicrous farce of validity. And we live with it because Ofsted say parents like it. Parents don't know any different because that's what they've been fed for 20 years. It's the only reality they know. But actually, It's meaningless and toxic. So I feel really strongly about that. It's just not healthy, and it's only people who benefit from it that allow it to persist. So if you're all the king of the hill and you parade your outstanding and all that, you love that and the kudos of it, and you lord it over other people.
Yeah.
So for me, that kind of I sometimes characterize it as a kind of the big cojones kind of attitude, the kind of the Michael Wilshaw kind of bully boy rhetoric. I just think it's an absolute disgrace. I really do.
Yeah, I 100% agree. It is ridiculous, and like on so many levels, it's like, just on an ethical level, it's like just to grade somebody as inadequate is profoundly just not okay. And it creates all these perverse sort of like consequences. So, like it makes things a lot harder for those schools that are in those positions to recruit kids, to recruit parents. And so it makes it like even harder for those schools to improve and to do what it needs to do, what they need to do. And like you say, if you know the slightest thing about social science, like the methodology just doesn't stand up to the slightest scrutiny. And have you ever seen that graph? Remember there was that blogger Jack Marwood who had a blog for a while called Icing on the Cake. I don't know if he's still around. And he did some really interesting analyses where he plotted Ofsted grades. So there was each school was the two plots was prior attainment, like entry to the school. So I guess it was like Key Stage 2 SATs and then GCSEs. And it forms a pretty tight correlation. Prior attainment is a really strong predictor of future attainment. And then they color-coded the dots according to what Ofsted grade they got at their last thing. And just like all the outstanding and good grades were just like from schools where kids had high prior attainment. And so it's like saying, it's just really outrageous and really unhelpful. And so how what would be your fix to this if you were to step out? I know you had a conversation with Daniel Mersch recently. If you were to step into Ofsted tomorrow, let's say that opportunity came knocking, what would you do?
I'd run back out the door.
Hit the cell, sack everyone.
I think, what have you done? Why am I here? No, so let's say I actually think. I mean, there needs to be in the system, but I'd say. So, for example, one of the things I think that we've got, say, local authorities and multi-academy trusts, and you can debate whether they should still exist or not separately, but you've got authority or local bodies that know the schools well. And I think Ofsted should focus on making sure that those sort of local level structures are working well and should and check that they've got internal accountability procedures and ways of tackling underperformance and so on. But then within that system, like a multi-academy trust would be striving for excellence, and that would be to do with understanding what standards are, and you've got certain outcomes, you've got examinations, and in the ideal world some sort of baccalaureate pass rate or whatever. You've got internal data you understand, but you've also got evaluations of quality of curriculum and students' experience, which is good. And I think Ofsted should focus on making sure local systems have got good processes in place and share and do what one thing they do well is share practice. So this is what an excellent curriculum might look like. Look at these primary schools, look at the science curriculum, look how they've managed with limited resources to deliver this incredible music and arts program, and share and showcase and celebrate. But I don't think this idea of an inspection model or a 2-day visit, I just think it's a house of cards of validity. I think that's an absolute joke. The idea that if you look at how many things are covered in an inspection, it's outrageous. Just even things like challenging the more able or dealing with pupil premium and disadvantage or reading. Even inspectors I know, I've met them, they just say it's a kind of a joke, really. You go in, by break time on the first day, you've kind of guessed what the grade is, and you spend the rest of the time kind of proving that you're right. They tell me that themselves. They're like, and then you're spending half the time typing because you've got to get it all finished by the end of the 2 days.
Yeah.
It's a whole farce of a thing that we allow to persist. It just shouldn't happen. So for me, I just get rid of inspection completely. And I just get schools to be known by people close to them who see them progress from week to week, month to month. And at the level of knowledge of that, so I would have some teams who know what the multi-academy trusts do in each region, who know what the local authority, where it still exists, how they operate, because that's a manageable number of organisations to get to know well. But I think Ofsted isn't close enough to a school to really know how well that school is and what it's like.
Yeah,
there's just too many schools for them to realistically do that. So we've created this thing. So I'd axe it. I'd axe inspection completely. But I'd develop accountability in that way. And it's not like the accountability goes. And I'd start having reports which are based on a report which is a bit like, I would say, with instructional coaching, like, is agreed by the school and the people, so that the school's voice in their own self-evaluation is absolutely at the front and centre, validated by the people who know them and are comparing. And that's where we do things. This is what we're dealing with. This is what we're good at. This is what we're working on. And that's what parents get as information. Grading would disappear.
Yeah. I like it, and it's sort of obvious, isn't it, when you put it in this way? Like, there's only one Ofsted, and there's 30,000 schools, and there's no way that they can know them all well enough. And some of the schools go years or even decades without being inspected because they're deemed to be good or outstanding, and that they don't need it. And so the accountability, it's not like it's bad accountability. Like, the accountability just isn't there.
No.
I've known of a number of schools where the head teacher's been really serious problems in terms of like the head behaving just like in inappropriate ways, and everybody's like, this is not okay. Like the whole senior team is falling apart. This is a dysfunctional school.
Yeah.
And it's just like totally goes on like that for years without any sort of local oversight. So it's very obvious that the switch that you're talking about is what needs to happen. Stop telling people they're inadequate, because how is that ever going to be helpful? And actually start doing like soft, low level, behind the scenes accountability that's actually meaningful and improvement focused.
I mean, I think this is the thing. Like, I mean, I had this experience myself. So having sort of been, having to leave a school after an inspection experience, and you're never supposed to discuss the circumstances and stuff. It's sort of everyone kind of knows, but you get in touch with your union and representatives, and these people are amazing. So honestly, they're absolute lifesavers. They pull people out of the hole, and they say, look, they said to me, look, you're doing fine. At least you can speak. And they say that every week we have people, every day pretty much, but certainly every week, we have head teachers in exactly the same situation calling us up, and some of them are just like absolutely ruined. They're just, at the end, they can't do anything else. They can never work again half the time because they're crushed, absolutely crushed. And they disappeared. No one ever knows where they've gone. And that still happens now. And how can you have a system that does that to people?
Yeah, I know. It's just profoundly wrong, isn't it?
They don't deserve it. They don't deserve it. These people have worked hard in tough schools and they get absolutely crushed. And nobody cares. And Ofsted, like Amanda Spielman, who I've met and I like her, but she's justifying a system which crushes people, and she does it knowingly.
Yeah.
And it's outrageous. I mean, how can we run a system which treats people with such contempt? Isn't it shocking? I mean, it makes me angry. It makes me so angry that it happens. I get contacted all the time because people see me as someone who's experienced this, and they reach out to me all the time.
Yeah.
And I have to write email to people saying, sometimes it's their wife or their husband is writing to me saying, I think you're someone who might be able to give us some advice. And you think, God, you poor thing, look what they've done to you.
Yeah.
They don't deserve it. It's like, it's wrong, isn't it? So even if someone's sort of struggling, they don't deserve to be kind of shamed. And you can tell, like in my voice, it affects you. It affects you forever. So sometimes people recover and they do something different, but I don't think a healthy system treats people that way.
No.
And I don't think it helps the kids either. I mean, you could say, well, we need good people coming in, but that's rare. It's rare for a school to sort of really sort of shift in that way when new people come in. It doesn't really. Sometimes you get people who are more sort of attuned to that particular culture and they do a slightly more effective job. But at a basic level, I've met some Ofsted people, and I just think, can you look yourselves in the eye and think you're doing the right thing for kids in this country when you're treating adults in your system in this way? And I don't think they realise sometimes what they're actually doing. When you're told that your school's going into be called inadequate, it's like it's almost theatrical. They almost might put a black cap on and saying, you are being sent down. Everyone's like in mourning, it's like...
Yeah, it is. It's very theatrical.
Why are we doing this? Until that goes, I just think there's so many other things won't shift because people are so scared of that happening to them that they do almost anything, even if it's sort of like horribly sort of shoehorning curriculum into being this very shallow, narrow curriculum to avoid any suggestion, or I don't know. There are perverse incentives, aren't there? So that's the main thing that needs to go.
Yeah, I agree, and it filters all the way down the system, doesn't it? Like it seems to be a fear-based response to whatever it is to school improvement. It's like this divide and conquer sort of thing. Like you're the good schools, you're the naughty schools, and we're sort of somehow going to use that against you. And that fear, it filters down. And I remember that dreadful like flood of adrenaline when Ofsted are in school, the flood that you get when you hear that we've had the call. Is like everyone just starts flapping around and just going like, it's a horrible feeling. And then when the door handle goes during an inspection and you're like, fuck, they're here. Or like even it's like an outer body, and it's just some kid coming in, but you like need 5 minutes to sort of calm down.
Yeah.
And even when there's one actually in your room, that's really surreal because you're like, oh my God, it's happening. This is the actual thing. You've built it up so much that it just like distorts whatever they're seeing is not normal anyway.
No.
But also like the mentality filters down. So that sort of naming and shaming thing, I've heard of schools that do this with kids, so that their attitude to learning scores, another thing for which there's scant, validity. Attitude to learning scores, not attainment, but just like how sort of, compliant they are essentially. They're named and shamed in a ladder along the school corridor, and it's like, these essentially the message is like these kids are sort of bad kids and they're holding you down. And again, my goodness, that's not okay.
No, that sort of thing is massively problematic, isn't it? So I feel like this sort of school shaming and stuff is wrong, and you've got to be very careful to be selective about whether you start doing that to the schools you like and the schools you don't like. You have to just say no. I'm not going to publicly talk about schools. It's always difficult. You never get the full story. The school has never really can reply. And there's always complexity. I mean, even still now, you get fallout from stuff that happened before because people have had a partial story and they've got this received version of it and they think that that's the truth, even though it isn't. But you can never really put that forward. So it's sort of. But of course, there are people, they're not saying that everyone is good or bad or schools can't fail and there can't be people who are out of their depth. And I'd probably say I was out of my depth in that school. But it's the way it's done. I mean, you have to have a way of people being able to sort of change with dignity. And I just think that would be possible within a system where you didn't have grades. You just have evaluations and internal processes and then managing the message to parents. This idea that we all deserve to know everything. I don't agree with that. I think accountability has many forms, and you don't have to have blow by blows on everything. It's just not appropriate.
Yeah, and I would extend that to the way that we assess kids as well. But that's maybe a separate conversation.
Yeah.
So is there anything else in the challenges?
I think there's a challenge around assessment. So I think currently our system, you can leave school with a load of grade 1 GCSEs or 5 of them or 2, and then you go to a college and you do a 1 subject level 1 or 2 a BTEC and hopefully get onto an apprenticeship and get out of that, or get a job. But at the other end, you've got someone doing their 4.5 A levels and an EPQ, and they're in the orchestra and they go on Duke of Edinburgh, and it's like the chalk and cheese of that is again appalling. Like the children who are already at the struggling end of academic success also get the weakest provision in terms of wraparound opportunity in our system, and I just think that's poor as well. So I think a kind of national baccalaureate type situation where everybody universally, all learners without exception, had an entitlement to certain levels of provision up to 18 would be a much better system. But currently we have this sort of very deeply embedded sheep and goats effect, which not only affects the levels of a subject range that children can access, but also the wraparound. Because FE colleges are so underfunded, it's not even funny. It's like they can barely afford to deliver a kind of 18-hour program, and then they have to do maths and English resit. That the hours for that come out of their main program. And I don't think people even realise that it's not extra. Like, so if you need to do an hour, 3 hours a week out for maths and English, that's 15 hours left for your core program. There's just a poor relation every which way, and that's not right. So I feel like that reframing an inclusive qualifications framework.
So this would involve not having GCSEs and having something that was assessment right the way through to 18, or is this alongside GCSEs?
Well, this is a good discussion, actually, because at the moment, I mean, we've just launched a consultation. I'm a trustee of the National Baccalaureate Trust, along with a few other people, and we've just put a consultation out about this so that we're going to write a report later this year about it. But basically, it's one of the questions we're asking, that there are two ways to do it. Either you just sort of replace everything with a newly constituted National Baccalaureate with new components in it and reconfigure A-levels and GCSEs and BTECs and other vocational qualifications into a new set of things that you all delivered. Or you start with what we've got already and we wrap around the baccalaureate and say your GCSEs and your A-levels and your vocational qualifications contribute towards the baccalaureate. And then you would perhaps need to do slightly fewer GCSEs because each one of them on its own doesn't matter too much. It's about the whole totality. So there are different ways of doing it in different schools of thought about whether you remove GCSEs or just phase them out or just do fewer of them. But basically, we're talking about reshifting from the main heavy line of accountability and target sort of terminal qualifications to 18 for everybody rather than 16, And then you have a kind of transcript which says, when I'm 18, I have a transcript which says, these are my high level qualifications. These are what I finished when I was 16. This is my personal development program. This was the project that I did. And it's got this holistic feel about it, all on electronic transcript. And everyone would just be saying, your CV would be like, here's the QR code for my transcript, and there you go. And then you open it up and go, oh, wow, look at what you did at school. And it's got all your components in there, and it adds up to something. And there are other debates. There are other debates to have about whether that's got a point system or just the things stand for themselves. So I think that's an exciting thing to look at. And it's well within the grasp of the technology at the moment to have a national transcript for everybody, which is then passports for 11 to 16 schools. They passport students through into FE and sixth form colleges, and the same process continues. And to me, that's the way we should be going. And there's quite a lot of people who agree with that.
Yeah, well, there's obviously there's this group that's been very active recently, the Rethinking Assessment Group, who are looking at this question. So let's just go back a step and just so you're talking about this thing, a national baccalaureate, and I know that you've been working on this for quite some time. What is a baccalaureate for anyone who I just looked it up because I've heard of the International Baccalaureate, and I know that the so-called EBAC, the English Baccalaureate, which was essentially a way of saying that there's 5 academic subjects, so it's like English, math, science, a language, and a humanity. I just looked it up, and it seems to be a French word. It says a baccalaureate is an exam in several subjects taken in the last year of school around the age of 18 in France and some other countries. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah. So
why is it called that?
A baccalaureate comes from the International Baccalaureate. It basically means a terminal qualification which is more than the sum of its parts. So all the components add up to one whole. And so, and then it's a question of what goes into it. So in the International Baccalaureate, it includes, at the diploma level, it includes 6 subjects. It includes a theory of knowledge assessment, an extended essay, creativity, action, and service, as it's a whole personal development program. And it's all wrapped up through linked concepts like international mindedness, and it's got a whole philosophy. So the whole thing, if you pass the IB, you've got some subcomponents which have scores and so on, but you've got things like the CAS program, which has no score. It's just something you've finished and it's completed, and it has to be a certain volume. And so it's a wraparound. It's the whole thing. I think it's exceptional. I think it's like the gold standard qualification. So the case is, could you have that for everybody? Well, yeah, you could, but you could have it at entry level, foundation, intermediate, and higher. You wouldn't have to have it just only at advanced level. We've got, could you broaden up the types of subjects? So when I say it's in a French baccalaureate, it's basically a series of exams they take towards their bac. Now, the EBAC in England is like a joke. One reason I'm so determined to call it the baccalaureate is the EBAC is an absolute embarrassment of an idea that you've got this collection of 5 traditional subject areas at Key Stage 4 called a baccalaureate, where it doesn't even add up to anything. There's no baccalaureate as such. The children don't get anything. It's just an accountability tick. Like, have they done maths, English, science, a language, and humanities? They don't even have to do a language and humanities. It's just one of the two. It's bizarre that's a thing. But just Michael Gove or someone decided to call it the EBAC, but that was probably just in some random moment. It's not a baccalaureate. So a baccalaureate is much bigger than that, and it includes a record of all the things you've achieved. So that's what we're after. I think a national baccalaureate for England would be amazing. Every student all the way through school would be saying, what am I going to do to complete my bac? Well, I'm going to select some units of this. I'm going to do some units of that. I'm going to do some hires here. My personal project would be this. To get my personal development program, I've got to do some sport. I've got to do something creative. And it's like, yeah, that's great. That's what a curriculum should be like. And then everyone can do that in lots of different ways.
Yeah. So I mean, I agree that EBAC is an abomination, and it seems like it was maybe a policy idea to move kids away from choosing arts subjects, because that certainly seems to be what happened after the EBAC was introduced. Like lots of schools have even stopped doing like drama and design technology and so on, and that they're just like focusing very heavily on a narrower band of, like you say, those like traditional academic subjects. And it seems like that is part of the thinking. Like Gavin Williamson there was a thing on Conservative Home this week. He said recently something like that it's really good that like STEM subjects, that there's been an uptake in STEM subjects because so many people have got dead end degrees, and that they're saddled with debt for getting dead end degrees. It seems like the Education Secretary isn't a fan of people becoming educated in anything other than science and technology and engineering, which is an interesting position for him to take. So it does seem like there's this like fetishization of science and technology, the sort of the Dominic Cummings agenda at the expense of what's seen as sort of, like, I don't know, like frivolous somehow, like creative design type stuff is seen as somehow less important.
I think there's lots of things here. I mean, I could talk this for endlessly, but I think there are a number of competing issues, and one of them is that within that you do have this problem that art subjects, for example, or anything is only given a value if you take a qualification in it, and that's one of the fundamental problems. So with an overarching baccalaureate, it'd be perfectly valid for someone to sort of be in the orchestra and engage in music as a performer and a composer without having to take an exam. So if that's part of their curriculum experience and it's given credit because it contributes towards their back, that has value. Doesn't mean it's less valuable because they haven't got a qualification in it, because it all contributes to the same. And also you've got this I just think it's one of those weird paradoxes of the EBAC fans, which is that you've got children who are in year 8 in some schools, perfectly allowed to start GCSEs in year 9. And so they stop doing history in year 8. And they proudly are doing the EBAC because they're doing maybe French and geography in year 9, 10, 11. But they're not doing any history at all. So you can say history really matters. History really matters. Everybody should learn history. It's a proper subject. But actually, you don't have to do it. You can finish it in year 8. So I think that's weird. You kind of your cake and eat it. History and geography aren't just equal kind of alternatives. They're totally different subjects. So for me, it's just a total blind alley of argument that history really matters unless you decide not to do it.
Yeah.
So you can't resolve that. It's a forever paradox, the idea that you can pick one of the two. If history matters that much, why doesn't everybody have to do some history? Why do they have to stop? So one of the things I feel with like one of the advantages you have in, say, an American system is that you every year you select credits that you study. So you might do a unit on contemporary, 20th century history or something, and the next year do a unit on sustainability or something like that, and it's part of your whole baccalaureate. But you don't have to take some final terminal exam in each of them. You just are gradually increasing your knowledge. So you've done some history and some geography, maybe a slightly less of each one. And I think that type of flexibility is good. At the moment, we have a narrowing effect because we have to make choices. And so you do have some children. Now, I've got some curriculum models on my blog that I've collected where in one school model I have, they take their GCSEs for year 9, and in their key stage 3, they do an hour and a half a week of history. So that's like, whereas in another school, they do 3 hours. They do 2 hours a week for 3 years. So when you add that up, that's actually double the amount of time for history. And then even if you drop the subject. So that's a massive range in the country where you've got literally some children who don't take history at GCSE have got half the curriculum time at secondary school than other children. That's a perverse consequence of us having this need for everything to be about qualifications at 16. It doesn't need to be that. And then art's definitely squeezed. My daughter did drama and art GCSE, both of them. They were probably two of her most demanding GCSEs. She loved them, and they were but they were hard work. Wow.
Yeah.
Nothing soft about them at all. And so it's so rare now to find a model where you could do 2 arts GCSEs, never mind everyone doing 1. That's very rare.
Yeah. My son had to choose 1. And so to come back to the National Baccalaureate, You say that it's something where all of these different strands add up to one whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. Is there like an overall grade that's attached to this one thing? Is there like an overall? I don't know if this is the case for the IB.
Yeah,
do you get
is.
like one overall grade for an IB? And would this be the case with the NatBack as well?
Well, that's the thing that we're asking people's view at the moment. I mean, from the survey, I've made a poll and people are responding. So far, it's a bit 50-50. Some people, it's literally half and half. This is a policy that's up for discussion. So in the IB, you get a total of points is out of 45. And so you might say my IB score is 36, which is quite high. Then the very highest attainers get 40 something. I think 23 is the minimum to sort of pass. Below that, you have to get, you kind of call it, you don't get the full diploma. So there is a total score. For some situations, the total score tells you something. But within that, you also know that the scores I got for my 3 hires or my standards or whatever. So you can actually, so you don't necessarily need the score. My preference would be that you pass the baccalaureate, say, I've completed the baccalaureate. And yes, I've finished all the components. And then open up my portfolio. What does it show inside? Well, it shows that I got some sub-scores. I got this qualification. And that one, I did my such and such award in arts. And I got this community leadership award or whatever. And I've done some sub-components which are accredited and some not accredited. This is my personal development program signed off by my college. And it's like a mixture of assessed elements and non-assessed elements, adding up to completing the baccalaureate, which meets the standard. Some people say that in each of those points should be given a certain credit score, and that adds up to a total score. The risk there is you end up with sort of people again, accountability measures based around number of students getting above a certain credit score. So there are different debates to be had about that.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating thing. So again, is there anywhere that can we put a link to this consultation in the show notes if people want to get involved in this?
Definitely, I'll send it to you. I mean, we had literally a webinar last week, where people, a number of people joined us, or we explained it, and we've got a number of partners. So, all the key teaching unions, official bodies, exam boards are aware of it, and we're hoping that they've got several months to respond to our consultation, and then we'll come up with a set of proposals which we say this is what we think should happen. And every time I've presented it's people that understand the logic of it. I think what's happened though in the last few years is that we just couldn't get any traction because the reforms that came through in 2014-15 around curriculum were so overwhelming. Everyone was just totally saturated with rolling out the new GCSEs, the new A-levels, and there's just enough else to worry about. So this has always felt like a bridge too far. But now I feel the time is people are much more interested in. People now have had a couple of years of the full weight of Year 11 GCSEs, and it's just insane. I mean, you do not need 3 exams in history, or all in May. It's just silly. And even people who are strong exam advocates like me, I think exams are really important in the system. I still think there are too many.
Yes. Yeah. On that we agree for sure. All right. Well, I've got an eye on the clock. We're coming up to 3 hours here, which is probably as much as our listeners can take, especially and yourself, given that you had such an early start today. So let's wrap this up for now. I think it's possible. I know we've talked about possibly having a conversation about. There's an aspect of the trad prog debate, which I think that we might pick up, and I might publish that as an addendum to this episode, a conversation that we might pick up with Adam Boxer in a few days, but we won't go into that right now, unless there's anything else that you would like to add. Like, is there anything that you would like to ask of our listeners? I mean, we can share with them links to the NatBack and to EduGive. Is there anything else that you would like to say as a parting comment?
No, I mean, I just think if you're listening to this, it's probably because you're someone who's engaged in thinking about education in a very deep way. And if you've got this far to the end, then you're absolutely hardcore. So I just say thank you for listening. But mainly, I just think to keep celebrating the idea that the profession is on the way up. And I think we should talk the profession up. I feel like there's a lot of great things happening out there. And it's really exciting to be part of that. And talk up the profession. It's a great time to be a teacher, and I really, really believe that. And the more people who say that, the better.
I agree. It does feel like a really exciting time. Like one of the first things that I ever wrote about education was about the need to free education policy from endless political tinkering, and from having it tied to like the short-term electoral cycle. And I can remember sort of talking to people around that time, and a fairly strong counter argument is that, you know, like schools and the teaching profession didn't really sort of have its house in order, you know, 10 years ago. Like there was quite a lot of sort of flaky practice going on, and people weren't particularly research engaged. And it really feels like the profession has been growing in stature through this period of time that you've been describing, and all these sort of robust conversations, and the abundance of books that are being published by frontline teachers as well as people around the outsides. It does feel like a time when we are, you know, stronger than ever before as a profession, and therefore in a stronger position to start to make the case that actually we can start to look at the question of how we can figure out some sort of longer term policy framework that isn't just, you know, endless tinkering, because that's what's so sort of disappointing, isn't it, when like it's like the endless change is just, that was another I think the piece that I wrote about that was like the piece that I wrote, it was one of those pieces in The Guardian, The Secret Teacher, and it started, the only constant is constant change. And that's sort of what it feels like. You just sort of get used to some new curriculum, some new assessment framework, some new Ofsted framework, whatever it is. And then it just all changes again, and you never get to actually sort of just stop adapting to this never-ending cascade of policy initiatives. And it's exhausting, and some really good ideas get thrown out along the way. And it just seems like we need to figure out how we can transition to, you know, another way of organizing policy, and for teachers' voices to be much more valued in that process. And so it feels like we're closer to that than certainly than we were 10 years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, teachers and leaders, I feel if we kind of got our act together, we could probably like take a few institutions, you know, down and just say, look, we're just not standing for that anymore. It's just not how we do things. So I feel like, you know, that's there for the taking. I mean, so reforming accountability, having a baccalaureate, all these sorts of things. I just think there's a future education system which is even better than it is now. But I feel the profession is going to make that come about, not policymakers, probably.
Yes, yeah. Actually, kind of as a parting question, I saw a tweet that you posted earlier this week, which got quite a lot of traction, and I don't know if it was in response to. So I saw a piece yesterday by it was in the Test, and it was about Kevin Collins, who's the catch-up czar, which is a mantle that you wouldn't want to. No. It's interesting why he took that on, and I don't think that this is necessarily his central policy agenda, but somebody had asked the question, should we have extended school days? And his answer was, if we're going to do that, then they need to be compulsory. So of course the headline is like, we should have compulsory longer days. To have some sort of a catch up. And so you had an alternative vision for a recovery curriculum, or a recovery approach.
Yeah, basically, I mean, I just think there's so much lost energy in setting up these extra things that actually the main thing is there's so much mileage, there's so much slack, if you like, in just implementing the curriculum we've already designed. Probably a lot of work's going in and just really hit that home and teach really well to hit home with all the children learning what you're already doing really well. And then if there's any extra time, just focus on using that time to plan doing that really well. And then, you know, using things like lots of reading and homework. So if your children need sort of additional stuff, you've got homework and reading. And then that's it. You know, it's not some giant catastrophe. The kids... we don't need to do some sort of lurch into some extra sort of bolt-on thing. I just think that's a total misdirect.
Yeah. It's like shiny new thing syndrome, isn't it?
Yeah.
People sort of like the idea of doing new things, and that we need to respond to COVID with some shiny new thing. And so you're sort of saying, let's just actually, you know, double down, consolidate what we're already doing really well, and just make sure that we nail it, you know.
Totally. Nail it. I mean, you know, it's not like... And also if there's time to be found, well, teachers are already gasping for time to think about the curriculum, and that time is well spent. So I think the idea that you have even more lessons to prepare, or I don't even Kevin was he was saying that people should be paid. So he's not saying that existing teachers should just do more hours, which is probably what Michael Wilshire would say, because he doesn't respect people's working life.
No,
but it's yeah. So I just think, and I do think that what most people are saying is that's one of the few tweets of mine which sort of gets loads of likes, is because people say that's kind of what we're doing anyway. It's like, yeah, that's what we're doing, and it's what we're focusing on. So I just think that de facto that's what people are going to be doing. Of course, if they get some extra money and you have to spend it on certain things, I probably have to spend it on that. But like abacuses or whatever.
Oh my God, yeah.
Reckonricks.
Isn't that incredible?
Anyway, yeah, the crazy system.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you again for taking all this time. I really appreciate it. I hope you get to catch up on your missing sleep soon. I think you surviving the virtual jet lag admirably, far better than I certainly would be able to. So thank you again, and we will speak again soon.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Time is a measure of change. We don't have much time. Time is a measure